My daughter-in-law sent my wife an 18-dish Thanksgiving spreadsheet and ordered her to cook entirely alone. I booked us a flight to Italy instead and left a single note. Her frantic call came while we were enjoying a Michelin-starred dinner. My name is Jovan. I am 70 years old, and I spent my entire life building an empire so no one would ever disrespect my family. I stepped away from my transport company to enjoy peace, but peace is fragile. The iPad screen illuminated the dark mahogany desk in my home office. An email from Sloan, my son Kendall's wife, glared back at me. It was not a greeting or a request. It was a rigid Excel spreadsheet. It contained 18 complex Thanksgiving dishes, color-coded and meticulously scheduled. A bolded footnote at the bottom of the document demanded my wife Corinne arrive at their kitchen by 5 in the morning. She was instructed to cook alone to impress Sloan's visiting family. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to draw a hard line to protect the person you love most from entitlement. I stared at the screen, letting the sheer audacity of the demand sink into my bones. The list included deboned turkey hand-kneaded artisan breads, 3 specific types of stuffing, and an intricate dessert menu tailored to the dietary whims of Sloan's parents. The language used in the email lacked any warmth. It read exactly like a corporate directive handed down to a low-level subordinate. Sloan did not ask if Corinne needed help. She commanded her to bring her own specialized cookware because Sloan did not want her imported marble counters scratched. The glow of the tablet cast a harsh, unnatural light across the quiet room. I listened to the steady ticking of the grandfather clock in the hallway. I felt a cold, familiar anger rising in my chest. It was the exact same calculating rage I used to dismantle racist competitors in the logistics industry 40 years ago. I did not yell. I did not throw it. I simply absorbed the reality of what my son and his wife had become. They viewed us not as parents, but as a free catering service. The spreadsheet was a blatant insult carefully designed to put us in our place. I watched Corinne standing near the doorway. She walked over and looked over my shoulder at the glowing screen. I saw her left hand tremble slightly as she read the demands. It is a lingering neuropathy, a cruel and permanent reminder of the chemotherapy she endured 2 years ago. We spent months in hospital rooms fighting her breast cancer, praying for a victory we eventually won. Kendall knows this medical fact perfectly well. He sat in those same waiting rooms. He watched his mother lose her hair and her strength, yet Kendall permitted his wife to treat his mother like a hired servant anyway. Corinne did not complain. She possesses a quiet grace that has always humbled me. She simply sighed, a soft sound of resignation that cut me deeper than any scream could. She began to calculate the hours required to execute Sloan's impossible menu. My son owns a financial consulting firm. He understands numbers, limits, and human capacity. He knows a 67-year-old cancer survivor cannot stand on her feet for 14 hours, chopping, basting, and serving a dozen arrogant guests. He chose to look the other way to satisfy his wife's desire for the perfect holiday aesthetic. Sloan grew up in a middle-class family that desperately pretended to be high society. She married my son and immediately began spending the wealth I built to fund her illusions. Kendall enables her delusions because his ambition blinded him to basic decency. He wants access to the elite circles her parents pretend to inhabit. To them, having a black mother-in-law serve them a flawless, exhausting feast is the ultimate power trip. It is a display of dominance. Corinne adjusted her reading glasses, her trembling fingers brushing the edge of the tablet. She whispered that she would need to visit 3 different grocery stores to find the specific organic ingredients Sloan demanded. She began rationalizing their cruelty, suggesting that perhaps Sloan was just overwhelmed with hosting. I looked at the slight shake in her fingers. I remembered the nights I held her hand while the poison pumped through her veins to save her life. I promised myself then that she would spend the rest of her days in absolute comfort. My son was now asking her to trade her physical pain for his wife's social validation. The betrayal was absolute. It was not just a lack of consideration. It was an active, willful exploitation of a mother's unconditional love. Corinne reached across the mahogany desk for a yellow notepad and a pen. She intended to draft a preliminary grocery list to fulfill the 18-dish spreadsheet. I did not say a word. I reached out and snatched the notepad directly from her grip. I took the paper in both hands and tore it precisely in half. I dropped the torn pieces into the wastebasket beside my chair. Corinne looked at me with wide, confused eyes. I picked up my phone and dialed my executive travel agent. The agent answered on the first ring. I instructed him to book 2 first-class tickets to Florence, Italy, departing the very next morning. I ordered a suite at a luxury hotel overlooking the Arno River. I told the agent to spare absolutely no expense. Corinne stood in the quiet office, her confusion slowly transforming into realization. I ended the call and placed the phone face down on the desk. I looked my wife in the eyes and told her she would not be stepping foot in a grocery store. I told her she would not be kneading dough or roasting a turkey for people who viewed her as a domestic appliance. We were going to spend the holiday eating truffles and drinking vintage wine in Tuscany. The boundary was permanently drawn. I refused to negotiate with disrespect. Kendall and Sloan wanted a flawless Thanksgiving feast. They would have to figure out how to produce it themselves. I opened the spreadsheet one last time purely to memorize the magnitude of their audacity before deleting the email entirely. I stood up from my leather chair and guided Corinne out of the office. I told her to pack her bags for a European autumn. I went to the hallway closet and retrieved my heavy winter coat. I had a final task to complete before our flight. I needed to deliver the raw materials of their disaster. I drove to the premium butcher shop downtown and purchased the heaviest, most complicated raw turkey they had. I gathered bags of unwashed, uncut vegetables. I bought flour, raw sugar, and unpeeled potatoes. I paid in cash, loaded the heavy bags into the back of my SUV, and prepared to give my arrogant daughter-in-law exactly what she asked for, minus the free labor. The silent correction had begun. The bitter November wind whipped across the expansive manicured lawn of Kendall's estate, stinging my face as I stepped out of the SUV. The sky was still a bruised pre-dawn gray. The neighborhood was dead quiet, filled with houses that looked more like fortresses built to display wealth rather than provide shelter. I walked around to the trunk and hauled out 5 heavy grocery bags. They were packed with exactly what Sloan had demanded. 2 enormous rock-hard frozen turkeys, sacks of unwashed, unpeeled potatoes, bunches of celery covered in dirt, heavy bags of raw flour and sugar. Nothing was prepped. Nothing was easy. I carried the bags up the wide, sweeping stone steps and dropped them onto the freezing concrete of their front porch. The thud of the frozen birds hitting the ground echoed loudly in the quiet morning air. I stood there for a moment, my breath pluming in the cold, staring at the massive double doors of my son's home. This was the house Kendall claimed he earned through his brilliance. This was the house Sloan used to host her extravagant parties and impress her shallow circle of friends. I knew the truth. I looked at the towering columns and the pristine landscaping. I remembered the scent of industrial cleaner and the ache in my lower back. 40 years ago, I scrubbed concrete floors in a distribution warehouse on the night shift. I worked 80-hour weeks, saving every crumpled dollar bill to afford a modest 3-bedroom house in a decent neighborhood. I built a transport logistics company from a single broken-down truck to a fleet of 300. I sacrificed sleep comfort and sometimes my own dignity to ensure Kendall never had to scrub a floor. Now my 35-year-old son uses high-limit credit cards to sustain an illusion of grandeur. He signed the paperwork for this massive estate, but he did not have the capital to secure it. I did. I guaranteed the mortgage because I wanted him to succeed. I wanted to give him a foundation. Instead, he used that foundation to build a monument to his own entitlement. He believed his degree and his zip code made him superior. He believed that the wealth I generated was his inherent right. He allowed his wife to treat the woman who nursed him through childhood fevers like a disposable caterer. I pulled my coat tighter against the wind. The cold reality of my son's character settled over me. I had provided the money, but I had failed to instill the values. I reached into my pocket and pulled out a single sheet of heavy stock paper and a roll of heavy-duty packing tape. I had written the message the night before, my hand steady, my resolve absolute. I slapped the paper against the center of the glass front door and taped it down securely. The note was brief and devoid of any warmth. It read, "The ingredients are here, the kitchen is yours. Good luck." I did not knock. I did not ring the doorbell. I turned my back on the sprawling estate and walked down the driveway to my SUV. I slid behind the wheel, started the engine, and pulled away from the curb. I did not look back in the rearview mirror. I drove through the silent, affluent streets, my mind clear and focused. The GPS was already set. I navigated onto the highway, the headlights cutting through the lingering darkness, heading straight for the international airport. Corinne was waiting for me at the terminal, her bags packed, her passport in hand. We were leaving the chaos behind. The retaliation was in motion and there was no turning back. They wanted a flawless Thanksgiving feast. Now they had the raw materials and a stark lesson in respect. The rest was up to them. The ambient warmth of the Michelin-starred dining room in Florence provided a stark contrast to the freezing concrete porch I had left behind in America. Crystal chandeliers cast a soft golden glow across the heavy linen tablecloth. A waiter in an immaculate tuxedo had just poured a vintage Barolo into our crystal glasses, the rich crimson liquid catching the light. Corinne sat across from me, looking more radiant and relaxed than she had in months. The tension that usually tightened her shoulders around our son and his wife had completely vanished. She smiled, raising her glass to initiate a toast to our newfound freedom. Before our glasses could meet, the harsh, aggressive vibration of my mobile phone shattered the tranquility of the current moment. The device rattled against the fine linen, a persistent and demanding rhythm. I lowered my glass and glanced at the screen. The caller identification displayed a video request from Sloan. The timing was perfectly predictable. It was currently mid-afternoon on the East Coast, the exact hour she would have descended upon the kitchen, expecting a fully catered multi-course feast prepared by my wife. I did not rush to silence the device. I let it vibrate, letting the sheer entitlement of the caller manifest in the persistent ringing. Corinne looked at the screen, her serene expression momentarily faltering. I placed my hand gently over hers, signaling her to remain entirely at peace. I picked up the phone with deliberate, calculated slowness. I swiped the screen to accept the video call, angling the camera so it captured the elegant restaurant background, the fine wine, and my own unbothered expression. I did not offer a polite greeting. I simply waited for the inevitable explosion. The screen flickered instantly, revealing a chaotic scene that brought a deep, profound sense of satisfaction to my chest. The trap I had left on their doorstep had been sprung. The illusion of their perfect, effortless holiday was disintegrating in real time. I held the phone steady, offering them a clear view of the luxurious Italian escape they had unwittingly funded with their arrogant behavior. I took a slow, deliberate breath, preparing to face the furious wrath of a woman who had finally realized she was absolutely no longer in control of the unfolding family narrative. The heavy silence between us stretched thin, loaded with the impending collision of our two realities. Sloane's face filled the screen, her features contorted into a mask of pure, unadulterated rage. Her perfectly styled hair was disheveled, and her high-pitched voice pierced the sophisticated ambiance of the Italian dining room. She screamed through the small speaker, demanding to know where Corinne was and why 5 bags of frozen, unprepared groceries were sitting on her pristine porch. Behind her frantic form, I could see the expansive kitchen island I had paid for. It was entirely covered with the raw ingredients I had delivered hours earlier. 2 massive, rock-hard frozen turkeys sat in the center of the marble counter, flanked by unwashed root vegetables and unopened bags of flour. Sloane's parents paced in the background, their faces red with visible outrage. They were dressed in formal holiday attire, clearly expecting to be served a lavish meal upon their arrival. Instead, they were standing in a chaotic, non-functional kitchen. Sloane accused me of intentionally sabotaging her family's sacred holiday out of sheer spite. Her words were sharp, vindictive, and entirely devoid of self-awareness. She yelled that her parents had traveled across the country for a traditional feast and I had ruined their entire vacation. I watched her frantic gestures and listened to her shrill accusations. She never once asked about Corinne's well-being. She never acknowledged the impossible, exhausting burden she had attempted to place on a 67-year-old cancer survivor. Her only concern was the preservation of her own social image and the embarrassment of facing her pretentious parents with an empty dining table. Her parents hovered aggressively in the background, crossing their arms and casting disgusted glares toward the phone camera. They were accustomed to being catered to, holding on to a false sense of superiority that Sloane had inherited and amplified. They believed that marrying into my son's wealth entitled them to the manual labor of his parents. I observed their collective panic with absolute emotional detachment. This was the exact scenario I had meticulously engineered. They wanted the aesthetic of a grand, opulent family gathering without contributing a single ounce of effort. They expected my wife to quietly sacrifice her health to maintain their shallow facade. Their current humiliation was the direct and unavoidable consequence of their own staggering arrogance. Sloane continued to shriek verbal demands, insisting we immediately return to the United States to fulfill our strict family catering obligations without any further delay or weak excuses. Kendall suddenly shoved his way into the camera frame. His face was twisted in a mixture of embarrassment and unrestrained fury. He violently ripped the phone from his wife's hand, the sudden movement causing the video feed to blur before stabilizing on his furious features. He pointed an accusatory finger directly at the camera lens. He did not ask for an explanation or offer any form of apology for the outrageous demands placed upon his mother. Instead, he immediately resorted to aggressive intimidation. He declared that my refusal to serve his wife's family was a permanent betrayal. He threatened to cut off all communication and sever our relationship entirely. His voice rose, carrying the desperate authority of a man trying to regain control in front of his humiliated in-laws. He stated that if we did not fix this Thanksgiving disaster, he would permanently block our access to any future grandchildren. He intended to use non-existent children as a weapon to force my compliance. I watched my son leverage his own hypothetical family to defend his wife's entitlement. The betrayal cemented my resolve. I did not raise my voice or react to his emotional blackmail. I remained perfectly still in my leather chair. I lifted the crystal glass from the table and took a slow, deliberate sip of the vintage Barolo wine. The rich flavors grounded me in the present moment, far away from their manufactured suburban crisis. I lowered the glass and looked directly into my son's desperate eyes through the digital screen. My voice was calm, steady, and cut with absolute ice. I delivered my final statement without a single trace of hesitation. I only cook for people who respect my wife. I did not wait for his response. I did not give him the opportunity to hurl another empty threat or attempt another manipulation. I simply pressed the red button and ended the video call. The screen went completely dark, severing the connection to their chaotic kitchen. To ensure the boundary remained absolute, I held down the power button on the side of the device. The phone vibrated once before shutting down entirely. I placed the lifeless device face down on the table next to my wine glass. The war had officially escalated, and I had just fired the opening shot. I looked across the table at Corinne. She smiled, and we resumed our peaceful Italian holiday dinner. The morning sun over Florence painted the Arno River in brilliant strokes of gold and amber. The crisp Tuscan air felt entirely removed from the domestic warfare taking place across the Atlantic. I woke up with a singular objective for the day. I wanted to reward Corinne for the quiet grace she had maintained over the past turbulent 48 hours. We walked hand in hand along the ancient cobblestones of the Ponte Vecchio. The historic bridge was lined with premier jewelers displaying their finest craftsmanship. Corinne stopped in front of a small, exclusive boutique. Her eyes locked onto a breathtaking diamond collar necklace resting on a velvet display cushion. It was an exquisite piece of art, understated, yet undeniably brilliant. I did not ask for the price. I simply guided her inside and instructed the jeweler to wrap it immediately. I pulled out my mobile phone to transfer the funds from my primary wealth management portal to my checking account. I opened the encrypted banking application and entered my biometric credentials. The screen loaded, but instead of displaying my standard portfolio overview, a massive red alert dominated the digital interface. My eyes narrowed as I read the automated security notification. A direct wire transfer of $15,000 had been successfully executed and cleared just moments before. The funds had not been moved from my primary operational accounts. They had vanished from a very specific, obscure joint account I rarely monitored. I stared at the harsh red numbers glaring back at me. $15,000 is a trivial sum in my financial empire. I can lose that amount in a minor stock fluctuation and never notice the deficit. But the amount was entirely irrelevant. The sheer audacity of the theft was what arrested my attention. The transaction details loaded on the screen revealing the destination of the stolen capital. The wire had been routed directly into the primary operating account of Kendall's financial consulting firm. The jeweler stood patiently behind the glass counter holding the velvet box containing the diamond necklace. Corinne looked at me, sensing the sudden shift in my demeanor. I locked my screen and handed the jeweler my solid black corporate card to finalize the purchase. I smiled at my wife, projecting absolute calm. Inside, the cold rage from the previous night had instantly solidified into absolute clarity. The Thanksgiving skirmish was over. The real war had begun. I escorted Corinne back to our luxury suite overlooking the river, ensuring she was comfortable before stepping onto the private balcony. The cool Italian breeze brushed against my face as I stared down at the water. I needed a moment to process the sheer magnitude of my son's fatal miscalculation. That specific joint account was never meant to be utilized for casual expenses or petty revenge. I established that financial safety net exactly 5 years ago. It was the exact month Kendall officially launched his independent financial consulting firm. I refused to hand him a massive pile of unearned capital to start his business. I wanted him to understand the heavy burden of payroll, the crushing weight of overhead, and the necessity of strategic planning. I wanted him to build his own empire from the ground up, just as I had done decades prior. However, I am a father who intimately knows the devastating volatility of the corporate world. I secretly opened that joint account and deposited a healthy sum of emergency liquidity. I provided Kendall with the routing numbers and a single directive. I told him the money was a phantom parachute. It existed solely to prevent him from facing personal bankruptcy or federal default if a catastrophic market collapse ever threatened to destroy his livelihood. He was instructed to forget the account existed unless he was staring directly into the abyss of total financial ruin. I explicitly warned him that touching those funds without a dire emergency would permanently sever the trust between us. For 5 years, the balance remained completely untouched. It collected minimal interest, serving its purpose as a silent guardian in the background of his career. Kendall had respected the boundary because he wanted to prove he did not need my assistance. Yesterday, I stripped away his wife's superiority by refusing to let Corinne act as their unpaid servant. Today, Kendall retaliated by crossing the one absolute financial line I had clearly drawn in the sand. He did not take the $15,000 because his firm was failing. He took it as a direct punitive strike to prove he could still reach into my pockets. He mistook my strategic generosity for a permanent weakness. He believed his status as my flesh and blood shielded him from the consequences of outright theft. The trust between a father and his greedy son was now completely dead. I stepped back into the suite and closed the heavy glass doors, sealing out the sounds of the bustling Italian street below. I dialed the direct extension of my private wealth manager back in the United States. He answered on the second ring. His voice usually projected polished confidence, but today he stammered, his tone laced with poorly concealed panic. I bypassed standard pleasantries and demanded a comprehensive explanation for the unauthorized $15,000 withdrawal. The manager hesitated before explaining that standard fraud prevention protocols were completely bypassed due to a legally binding document submitted just an hour prior. He nervously informed me that the bank had received a formally notarized medical proxy via secure fax. I demanded he read the exact terminology of the filing aloud. The manager swallowed hard before reading the vicious, calculated lies my son had placed into the public record. The document falsely declared that I was suffering from a sudden and rapid cognitive decline. It claimed my mental faculties had deteriorated to the point where I could no longer be trusted to independently manage my own vast financial estate. It explicitly granted Kendall immediate emergency executive control over my secondary accounts to prevent me from squandering the family fortune. The implications of this maneuver hit me with the force of a physical blow. This was not merely a greedy child stealing pocket change. This was a highly coordinated, aggressive legal coup. Kendall and Sloan were actively moving to strip me of my autonomy, weaponizing the legal system to seize absolute control of my entire empire. They believed that because I was nearly 70 years old, I would simply roll over and allow them to relegate me to the status of a helpless, senile victim. They had orchestrated the Thanksgiving culinary demand as a calculated stress test. When I refused to capitulate to their ridiculous holiday orders and booked a flight to Europe instead, they interpreted my swift departure as proof of irrational, erratic behavior. They were now utilizing my Italian vacation as the primary evidence to support their fraudulent medical claims. I instructed the bank manager to instantly freeze all remaining secondary accounts. I ended the call and placed the phone on the marble nightstand. I looked at my reflection in the ornate mirror. I did not see a vulnerable old man. I saw a seasoned corporate warlord whose enemies had just made a fatal miscalculation. I turned away from the ornate mirror and retrieved a secondary device from my leather travel bag. It was a secure phone I maintained exclusively for highly sensitive corporate matters. I dialed Mitchell, my chief legal counsel. It was not yet dawn on the East Coast, but Mitchell answered on the first ring. His voice was sharp and immediately attentive. I did not waste time with pleasantries. I delivered the stark facts with absolute precision. I informed him that my son and daughter-in-law had executed a fraudulent medical proxy claiming cognitive decline. I explained they had already used it to siphon $15,000 from a dormant account. Mitchell absorbed the information in total silence. He did not offer useless sympathy. He simply asked for the exact timestamp of the withdrawal. I provided the details, and the gears of his legal machine instantly began to turn. Mitchell calculated the timeline of the bank transfer and deduced that the physical proxy documents had to be processed at the county courthouse when the doors opened at 8. We had a microscopic window of opportunity to contain the damage before the filing was formalized and digitized into the public record. Reversing a public declaration of mental incompetence requires a lengthy, humiliating legal battle. I refused to grant them that victory. Mitchell immediately dispatched 2 aggressive associate attorneys to the courthouse. They arrived just as the county clerk unlocked the heavy double doors. Armed with my pre-signed counter-directives and emergency injunctions, his team physically intercepted the courier hired by Kendall. The associates filed an immediate block on all proxy implementations bearing my name, citing active federal fraud and identity theft. They seized control of the narrative before the clerk could stamp the fraudulent papers. Mitchell stayed on the secure line with me, narrating the tactical strike in real time. He confirmed the filing was successfully halted and impounded by his associates. The initial assault on my autonomy had been neutralized. My assets were secured behind a new wall of legal injunctions. Mitchell assured me the county judge would freeze any further action from Kendall until a formal hearing could be convened. We had successfully barricaded the front gate, but defense was never my preferred strategy. I instructed Mitchell to transition immediately from containment to active retaliation. I needed to understand exactly why my son and his wife were moving with such desperate, reckless speed. Mitchell and I did not build our relationship over leisurely rounds of golf or polite charity galas. Our bond was forged in the brutal trenches of corporate warfare over 2 decades ago. When I first expanded my transport logistics company across state lines, I immediately encountered a coordinated syndicate of entrenched competitors. These were older, exclusively white-owned firms who operated under the arrogant assumption that the transportation industry belonged to them by right. They viewed a rising black entrepreneur not as a legitimate competitor, but as an aberration that needed to be swiftly eradicated. They illegally colluded to price me out of essential shipping routes. They intimidated regional suppliers into canceling my contracts. They even orchestrated baseless regulatory audits to cripple my operations with bureaucratic red tape. I realized very quickly that I needed a lawyer who was absolutely not afraid to fight dirty in the dark. I found Mitchell working in a cramped downtown office, nursing a reputation for being dangerously aggressive and fiercely intelligent. I hired him directly on the spot. I did not ask him to defend my company. I instructed him to dismantle theirs. For 3 years, we worked side by side in windowless rooms, meticulously dissecting our enemies' corporate structures. Mitchell discovered their hidden monopolies, their illegal price-fixing agreements, and their unrecorded kickbacks. We did not just file lawsuits. We launched a campaign of absolute financial destruction. We bled them dry in civil court, exposed their illegal practices to federal regulators, and systematically acquired their bankrupt assets for pennies on the dollar. Mitchell watched me negotiate the final buyout of the syndicate leader, stripping the man of his life's work without displaying a single ounce of pity. Mitchell intimately knows the depth of the darkness I am capable of summoning when my family or my legacy is threatened. He understands that I do not issue empty threats. I execute permanent solutions. He is the only man alive who has seen the absolute ruthlessness required to build my empire from nothing. Therefore, when I told him to transition to active retaliation against my own son, Mitchell did not question the morality of the directive. He simply recognized the cold, familiar tone vibrating in my voice. He knew the great shark was no longer resting dormant. The predators who thought they could casually consume my estate were about to discover they were swimming in waters I controlled. I remained on the line as the morning sun illuminated my Italian balcony. I ordered him to deploy his forensic team immediately. I needed them to rip through the digital fabric of Kendall and Sloane's lives. People do not suddenly attempt to seize a multi-million-dollar estate out of nowhere. Such a drastic, felonious maneuver requires a powerful catalyst. I demanded to know exactly what was bleeding them dry. Mitchell hung up to coordinate the invasion into their financial privacy. I sat by the window watching the serene flow of the Arno River, drinking black coffee while I waited for the inevitable truth. 3 hours later, my secure phone vibrated against the marble table. Mitchell had the complete dossier. He skipped the prologue and delivered the lethal facts. The crisis did not originate with my son's consulting firm. It was entirely rooted in Sloane's fragile vanity. She owned a luxury designer boutique in a high-end commercial district. She portrayed it online as a thriving, glamorous enterprise. Mitchell stripped away the filters and exposed a staggering financial catastrophe. The boutique was bleeding thousands of dollars every single month. Sloan had taken out multiple high-interest predatory business loans to sustain the illusion of success. She was currently drowning in over $100,000 of toxic debt. Furthermore, she was 90 days delinquent on her commercial lease. Her wealthy parents, possessing all image and no actual liquid capital, had flatly refused to bail her out. Kendall's consulting income was entirely insufficient to plug the massive hole his wife had blown through their finances. They were weeks away from complete public bankruptcy. The pieces of the puzzle clicked together with chilling clarity. The Thanksgiving spreadsheet demanding Corinne cook alone was never just about a holiday dinner. It was a calculated psychological stress test. They needed to see if my mind was weak enough, and if my resolve was soft enough to be manipulated into total submission. If I had bowed to their demands, they would have slowly chipped away at my assets. Because I chose to walk away and fly to Europe, their timeline collapsed. Panic set in. The impending destruction of Sloan's boutique forced their hand, driving them to execute the fraudulent medical proxy in a desperate grab for my estate. They believed my wealth was their designated life raft. I smiled, feeling the cold air against my face. They were completely wrong. The morning sun rose higher over the terracotta roofs of Florence, casting long shadows across our hotel suite. I ended the encrypted secure call with Mitchell and deliberately placed the heavy phone flat on the cold marble table. Most men in my position would have panicked. They would have booked the next immediate flight back to the United States, rushing home to defend their assets and desperately trying to prove their own sanity to a skeptical judge. I did no such thing. Panic is a luxury reserved for the unprepared. I calmly poured myself another hot cup of black coffee and watched the Arno River flow steadily beneath our private hotel balcony. My son and his wife expected me to act out of fear. They relied on the assumption that an elderly man accused of cognitive decline would react with erratic, frantic desperation, thereby proving their exact point. I refused to play the role they had scripted for me. I turned to Corinne, who was quietly reading a novel on the velvet sofa. I told her we were extending our stay in Italy for a few more days. I did not burden her with the sordid details of Kendall's fraudulent medical proxy or Sloan's impending bankruptcy. I simply informed her that I had a brief, unexpected corporate matter to handle locally. I walked down to the hotel concierge and requested a private car. I explicitly instructed the driver to take me away from the tourist districts and head toward the outskirts of the city. We drove through the winding, sunlit streets of Tuscany until we arrived at a sprawling modern compound surrounded by manicured gardens. It was the premier psychiatric and neurological institute in all of northern Italy. The facility was renowned globally for its rigorous diagnostic standards and elite medical professionals. I stepped out of the black sedan and buttoned my suit jacket. I walked through the sliding glass doors with the steady, measured pace of a man who knows exactly what he is purchasing. I approached the reception desk and presented my passport alongside my corporate credit card. I demanded an immediate comprehensive neurological evaluation. I effortlessly bypassed the tedious waiting list by paying double their standard premium fee in crisp, untraceable cash. I desperately needed a weapon forged in absolute medical certainty, and I was unequivocally going to secure it before the Italian sun officially set. A black man who built a vast logistics empire completely from the dirt knows how the world operates. I have navigated countless boardrooms filled with individuals who constantly underestimated my intellect due to the color of my skin. I learned early in my career that the American legal system is uniquely unforgiving, especially when vast sums of wealth are suddenly contested. The courts will eagerly weaponize a dementia claim if the narrative fits their preconceived biases. Kendall and Sloan understood this societal vulnerability. They calculated that a sympathetic judge would look at a wealthy, aging black man and readily assume his mental faculties were inherently failing. It is a classic, devastating legal maneuver designed to quietly strip a patriarch of his hard-earned autonomy. If I attempted to fight their fraudulent proxy using a domestic doctor, my son would simply hire 3 aggressive psychiatrists to dispute the findings. The legal battle would quickly degenerate into a humiliating public spectacle, draining my resources and severely damaging my corporate legacy. I absolutely refused to subject myself or Corinne to that prolonged indignity. I required an ironclad, completely undisputable, and internationally recognized medical stamp of absolute sanity. The Florence Institute was completely immune to American legal manipulation. Their diagnostic testing was legendary for its brutal difficulty and unyielding precision. A clean bill of cognitive health from their chief neurologist carried the indisputable weight of supreme empirical evidence. It would instantly shatter my son's fragile legal framework into 1,000 jagged pieces. I was not merely seeking a simple medical clearance. I was actively forging a massive, impenetrable shield to protect the wealth I had bled to accumulate over 4 decades. My son had grown incredibly comfortable utilizing my money to elevate his status, while completely ignoring the brutal sacrifices required to generate it. He believed that holding a piece of paper signed by a corrupt notary was enough to dethrone me. He possessed zero understanding of the cold, calculated warfare I survived to secure my position. The receptionist finished processing my passport and handed me a thick stack of intake forms. I took the clipboard and the pen. I knew the ensuing examination would push my mental endurance to the absolute limit. I entirely welcomed the formidable challenge standing squarely in front of me. I was aggressively preparing to fundamentally crush their pathetic rebellion using the absolute indisputable brilliance of my own fully functioning mind. A senior neurologist and 2 specialized clinical psychologists escorted me into a stark, brightly illuminated examination room. For 4 grueling hours, they subjected me to the most extensive cognitive battery available in modern medicine. They tested my memory retention, spatial reasoning, complex problem solving, and advanced logical deduction. They deliberately created high-pressure scenarios to gauge my psychological resilience and emotional regulation. I did not falter for a single second. I approached their rigorous testing with the exact same lethal concentration I used to negotiate multi-million-dollar transport acquisitions. I dismantled their spatial puzzles and executed their verbal memory tests with clinical, unyielding precision. When the exhaustive session finally concluded, the chief neurologist reviewed the comprehensive data. He looked at me with profound professional respect. He explicitly confirmed that my cognitive functions were not merely normal, but entirely exceptional. I scored in the absolute top percentile for my age bracket, demonstrating the mental acuity of a man 20 years younger. The Institute immediately generated a massive legally certified medical dossier documenting my flawless cognitive health. The document was authenticated with official seals signed by the lead physicians and formally notarized under strict European medical law. I walked out of the Institute holding the physical evidence that would fundamentally destroy Kendall's fraudulent proxy. I immediately scanned the entire dossier and securely transmitted the encrypted files directly to Mitchell back in the United States. Mitchell was waiting patiently at his desk. He swiftly engaged a certified legal translator to process the Italian medical documents into flawless English. Within 2 hours, Mitchell marched directly into the county courthouse. He filed the indisputable medical evidence under a strict judicial seal, officially attaching it to the injunction against Kendall's proxy. The court now possessed irrefutable proof that my son had committed blatant perjury to seize my estate. The legal tide shifted completely and instantly. Kendall and Sloan were no longer greedy relatives seeking control. They were now actively documented attempting to execute a felony against a fully capable, highly intelligent man. The first heavy steel jaw of my trap locked firmly into place. I stood outside the Italian clinic and deeply inhaled the crisp afternoon air. The initial defensive maneuvers were now fully completed. It was finally time to launch a devastating offensive strike. My son believed he could steal my kingdom. I was now absolutely prepared to systematically dismantle his entirely pathetic and greedy life. The afternoon sun over Florence cast long, elegant shadows across the private balcony of our penthouse suite. I sat in a wrought iron chair, a glass of sparkling water resting on the small mosaic table beside me. The air was crisp and carried the faint scent of roasted espresso from the cafes lining the Arno River far below. Corinne was inside resting peacefully after a morning spent exploring the Uffizi Gallery. Her tranquility was my primary objective, and achieving it required absolute ruthlessness toward those who sought to destroy it. I picked up my secure mobile phone and dialed Mitchell. The encrypted line connected almost instantly. He did not offer a greeting, knowing my calls carried immediate strategic weight. I did not waste a single second on pleasantries. I delivered a precise, unambiguous directive. I told Mitchell to completely sever my financial tether to Sloan. 3 years ago, I co-signed the commercial lease for her high-end designer boutique in the city's most exclusive retail district. It was a gesture of goodwill toward my son, a structural pillar meant to support his new wife's entrepreneurial ambitions. That pillar was now scheduled for immediate demolition. I instructed Mitchell to contact the property management group and formally withdraw my status as her financial guarantor. I told him to execute the withdrawal with extreme prejudice, invoking the specific termination clause I had secretly embedded in the original paperwork. I am a man who builds empires, and I never enter a binding financial contract without engineering an emergency exit strategy. Mitchell understood the exact mechanism I was referencing. He noted that triggering the clause would instantly destabilize her entire business operation. I replied that destabilization was not the goal. Absolute eradication was the objective. I wanted the ground beneath her boutique to crumble without a single warning tremor. Mitchell confirmed the drafted withdrawal documents were already sitting in his secure outbox, awaiting my final verbal authorization. I gave him the green light to initiate the legal strike. I ended the call and placed the phone back onto the mosaic table. The Italian breeze swept across the balcony, cool and refreshing. I leaned back in my chair, interlacing my fingers. I watched a flock of birds scatter across the terracotta rooftops. The first physical blow against my son and his arrogant wife had been officially launched. I drank my water slowly. The process of destruction required patience. Sloane operates under the profound delusion that her business success is a direct result of her own innate brilliance. She loves to portray herself as a self-made entrepreneur to her wealthy social circle. She frequently boasts about securing the most coveted retail space in the city's premier luxury district. She tells her friends that the landlord was highly impressed by her pristine aesthetic vision and her aggressive business acumen. That narrative is an absolute fabrication. The owner of that commercial district is a man named Richard Thorne. Richard is a former business associate of mine. We fought a brutal war against a corrupt transportation union together 25 years ago. We stood shoulder to shoulder in courtrooms and boardrooms, establishing a bond of mutual respect that goes far deeper than casual corporate networking. Richard operates his properties with extreme prejudice. He strictly requires his commercial tenants to possess a proven track record, flawless credit, and massive liquid assets. Sloane possessed absolutely none of those qualifications when she applied for the lease. She was a privileged young woman with a mediocre fashion degree and a portfolio consisting entirely of aesthetic sketches. Richard threw her initial application directly into the trash without a second thought. She only secured that prime real estate because I made a personal phone call to Richard. I vouched for her character. I leveraged my own immaculate reputation to convince him to take a severe risk on an unproven novice. I signed the commercial lease as the primary financial guarantor, effectively placing the full weight of my logistics empire behind her fragile boutique. My signature was the sole reason the heavy glass doors of her designer shop ever opened to the public. Sloane never acknowledged my intervention. She conveniently erased my massive financial shield from her origin story. She deeply resented any implication that she relied on her black father-in-law for her professional elevation. She wanted the prestige of the address without the heavy burden of gratitude. I allowed her to live in that arrogant fantasy for 3 years out of love for my son, hoping she would mature into a decent human being. Instead, she weaponized her fake status against my wife. She demanded Corinne serve her visiting parents to validate her manufactured wealth. Her fake status was now completely terminated. She would finally understand the true source of her power. I watched the Italian sun rise. Checkmate. Richard moved with the brutal efficiency that had made him a titan in commercial real estate. Less than an hour after Mitchell submitted the formal withdrawal of my financial guarantee, Richard dispatched his legal team to Sloane's boutique. The store was packed with affluent shoppers browsing heavily marked-up holiday inventory. Sloane was standing near the register, projecting the image of a wildly successful fashion mogul. Richard's primary enforcer, a towering man in a sharp charcoal suit, walked straight past the velvet ropes and the bewildered sales associates. He did not ask for a private meeting. He approached the main counter and loudly slammed a thick, heavily stamped folder onto the pristine glass display case. The loud crack silenced the entire boutique. Shoppers turned their heads, their hushed conversations completely evaporating. The enforcer clearly announced that he was officially serving her a 72-hour notice of default on her commercial lease. Sloane's arrogant smile shattered instantly, replaced by a mask of sheer, unadulterated panic. She frantically grabbed the folder, her hands shaking as she read the dense legal text. The document was an absolute death sentence for her business. Without my name backing her massive lease, the contract stipulated that she had exactly 3 days to produce a new financial guarantor. The replacement guarantor had to possess a minimum of $500,000 in verified liquid capital. If she failed to produce this impossible sum, Richard would seize the property, lock the doors, and completely liquidate her entire inventory to cover the remaining lease penalties. The shoppers in the boutique recognized the severity of the confrontation. They immediately abandoned their designer garments and swiftly exited the store, unwilling to associate themselves with a public financial disgrace. Sloane was left standing completely alone in the center of her crumbling kingdom. Her financial life support was abruptly severed. She had spent the last 3 years treating my family with thinly veiled contempt, assuming my wealth was a permanent, unbreakable shield for her own reckless spending. She believed my age made me too soft to ever strike back. She realized in that exact moment that I held the power to eradicate her entire identity with a single phone call. The boutique doors swung shut, leaving her trapped inside the hollow shell of her manufactured success. The silent correction had arrived, and it was entirely merciless. I received the final confirmation text from Richard himself. I reached across the mosaic table and picked up my primary personal mobile device. It had remained powered down since the explosive video call on Thanksgiving Day. I held the power button, feeling the familiar brief vibration as the screen illuminated against the fading Italian daylight. The moment the operating system connected to the international cellular network, the device practically convulsed in my hand. It vibrated with a harsh, relentless mechanical rhythm that lasted for 2 unbroken minutes. Notification banners cascaded down the digital display in a chaotic waterfall of sheer desperation. There were exactly 84 unread text messages, all dispatched from Kendall. I did not immediately open the application. I simply watched the lock screen fill with his frantic digital screams, taking a moment to appreciate the precise timeline of his psychological collapse. The initial messages, sent yesterday shortly after Mitchell's associates blocked his fraudulent proxy at the courthouse, were dripping with familiar arrogance. He demanded to know why the secondary accounts were frozen. He issued hollow legal threats, insisting his fabricated medical documentation would override my banking instructions. He commanded me to capitulate and return to the United States immediately to face my supposed cognitive decline. The tone was aggressive, condescending, and entirely detached from reality. Then the timestamps indicated a massive shift. The messages sent within the last hour documented the exact moment Richard's enforcer slammed the eviction notice onto Sloane's display counter. The unearned arrogance completely evaporated, instantly replaced by raw, unadulterated panic. The capitalization became erratic. The spelling errors multiplied. Kendall frantically begged for an explanation. He demanded to know why the commercial lease guarantee had been abruptly withdrawn without warning. He pleaded with me to call Richard and reverse the 72-hour default notice. He stated that Sloane was currently hyperventilating on the floor of her boutique, completely incapable of producing a $500,000 replacement guarantor. The steady progression from entitled corporate raider to a terrified, groveling child played out across 84 desperate text messages. The digital timeline perfectly captured the destruction of his fragile ego. He had operated under the assumption that he held the superior strategic position. He thought he was hunting a wounded, aging animal. He was now realizing he had locked himself inside a cage with an apex predator. I swiped the screen to unlock the device and began reading the specific contents of his meltdown. I scrolled through the frantic paragraphs, searching for a single trace of accountability. I found absolutely nothing. Even while begging for his financial life, Kendall demonstrated zero remorse for executing a fraudulent medical proxy. He did not apologize for attempting to seize my entire estate or for illegally siphoning $15,000 into his failing consulting firm. In his severely warped perspective, those felonies were simply necessary administrative adjustments. He actually attempted to justify the proxy in his messages, claiming he only filed the documentation because my refusal to cater to his wife's holiday demands proved I was acting vindictively. He genuinely believed that protecting the family legacy meant taking it away from me. The psychological disconnect he displayed was absolutely staggering. I provided Kendall with every possible advantage growing up. He attended elite preparatory schools and prestigious universities entirely debt-free. I paid for his education so he would have the intellectual foundation to build his own wealth. Instead, the privilege calcified into a toxic entitlement. He viewed my corporate empire not as a testament to decades of grueling labor, but as an endless reservoir designated exclusively for his comfort. His texts rapidly shifted from begging to vicious accusations. He blamed my vindictive mindset for actively destroying Sloane's lifelong dream. He typed furious paragraphs condemning my cruelty, insisting that revoking the lease guarantee was an act of unforgivable malice. He completely ignored the reality that Sloane's business was already drowning in $100,000 of high-interest commercial debt long before I removed my signature from her lease. He refused to acknowledge that her boutique was a failing vanity project propped up entirely by my reputation. Entitlement absolutely blinds a man to his own crimes. Kendall saw himself as a victim of a tyrannical father, rather than a criminal facing the immediate consequences of his own brazen theft. He firmly believed that marrying into my wealth granted him and his wife permanent immunity from failure. He expected me to quietly absorb their disrespect fund, their bankruptcies, and surrender my autonomy the moment I became inconvenient to their lifestyle. The messages were a masterclass in narcissistic delusion. He demanded I restore the financial guarantee immediately, promising to forgive my erratic behavior if I saved his wife's sinking reputation. He still believed he was in a position to negotiate terms. I continued reading, my expression hardening into stone. I did not type a single character in response. Replying to a hysterical adversary only validates their panic and provides them with leverage. Instead, I highlighted the entire unbroken chain of 84 text messages. I tapped the export function and forwarded the complete digital thread directly to Mitchell's encrypted legal server. These messages were not merely the ramblings of a desperate son. They established a crystal-clear, time-stamped legal trail of extortion harassment and admitted financial manipulation. Kendall had explicitly referenced the medical proxy and the frozen bank accounts in his frantic demands for money, inadvertently handing my legal counsel written confirmation of his motives. Mitchell now possessed the fabricated medical claim, my flawless European cognitive evaluation, the record of the stolen $15,000, and Kendall's own text messages, proving the entire conspiracy was rooted in Sloane's impending commercial eviction. The trap was fully loaded and lethal. I received a brief, automated confirmation that the data transfer to the legal server was successful. I pressed the power button on the side of the device and held it down firmly. The screen went completely dark. The mechanical vibrations ceased. I severed the connection, plunging Kendall back into absolute agonizing silence. He would spend the next several hours staring at his screen, waiting for a lifeline that was never going to arrive. The absolute absence of any response would slowly drive him completely insane. I placed the lifeless phone back into my travel bag and stood up from the wrought iron chair. I walked back into the warmth of the penthouse suite. Corinne had just awakened from her afternoon rest, looking refreshed and radiant in a flowing evening dress. She smiled, entirely shielded from the brutal corporate execution taking place across the ocean. I offered her my arm and suggested we spend the remainder of the evening walking through the Accademia Gallery. She happily agreed. We left the hotel and strolled through the historic streets of Florence, eventually standing in quiet awe before the towering perfection of Michelangelo's David. The magnificent marble sculpture stood bathed in soft light, projecting timeless strength and flawless composure. It was the perfect contrast to the violent, chaotic destruction currently consuming my son's fraudulent empire. I held my wife's hand, feeling completely at peace. My legacy was secure, my mind was legally untouchable, and the parasites attempting to drain my lifeblood were officially suffocating. The transatlantic flight from Florence to the East Coast provided a temporary cocoon of absolute silence. Corinne slept peacefully in the luxurious first-class cabin, entirely unaware of the legal and financial slaughter I had meticulously orchestrated from our Italian balcony. When the heavy wheels of the aircraft finally impacted the American tarmac, the reality of the impending war firmly reasserted itself. We bypassed the chaotic main terminal, entirely utilizing the private aviation customs protocol I maintained for corporate travel. A black luxury SUV was already idling on the perimeter, the driver standing at absolute attention. Corinne expected us to head directly back to our sprawling suburban estate to face the inevitable fallout of Kendall's ruined Thanksgiving. I instructed the driver to take the opposite route. I told my wife the house was undergoing emergency plumbing repairs that made it temporarily uninhabitable. It was a calculated fiction to preserve her pristine peace of mind. We drove straight into the heart of the city, leaving the manicured lawns of our neighborhood far behind. The vehicle pulled into the subterranean parking garage of a premier downtown luxury hotel. I did not approach the main reception desk. The reservation had been meticulously arranged days in advance by Mitchell using one of my dormant corporate shell companies. We were escorted up a private elevator directly to the penthouse suite. The expansive living space featured floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the glowing urban skyline, completely isolating us from the suburban battlefield. Corinne smiled, assuming this was simply an extension of our romantic holiday. I ordered a lavish room service dinner, poured her a glass of exceptional wine, and encouraged her to relax in the deep, soaking tub. While she unwound in blissful ignorance, I systematically established my command center at the heavy mahogany desk dominating the suite's primary office. I connected my encrypted laptop to a cellular hotspot, bypassing the hotel's public network. I was back on American soil, entirely off the grid and operating under total digital anonymity. My son believed I was either stubbornly hiding in Europe or flying home to surrender to his fraudulent medical proxy. He had absolutely no idea I was sitting less than 20 miles away, completely invisible and monitoring his every move. The shadow war had officially transitioned to the domestic front. My profound lack of trust in my son was not a sudden development born from the Thanksgiving incident. It was a tragic, slow-burning realization that had crystallized over several years of observing his staggering entitlement. When I initially booked the European escape, I did not merely pack my luggage and lock the front door. I executed a precise security protocol. A man who has spent 4 decades dismantling cutthroat competitors learns to constantly anticipate the absolute worst-case scenario. I knew that leaving a multi-million-dollar estate completely empty would present an irresistible temptation to a highly desperate adversary. 2 days before our scheduled departure to Florence, I hired an elite private security contractor. I explicitly bypassed my standard residential alarm provider to guarantee absolute operational secrecy. The specialized team worked entirely under the cover of darkness, installing military-grade, motion-activated surveillance cameras throughout the interior and exterior of my home. These devices were microscopic, seamlessly integrated into the crown molding, the intricate library bookshelves, and the heavy oak cabinetry of my private home office. They were programmed to stream encrypted high-definition video directly to a secure application on my personal tablet. I authorized this severe invasion of my own privacy because I possess an intimate understanding of human desperation. I thoroughly analyzed Kendall's psychological profile. He was a man accustomed to having his monumental failures instantly erased by my checkbook. I systematically modeled the exact trajectory of his impending collapse. I knew that once Mitchell froze the secondary bank accounts and Richard threatened Sloan with immediate commercial eviction, their manufactured suburban panic would violently escalate. Kendall would realize his fraudulent medical proxy was trapped in a legal blockade. He would discover his digital access to my liquidity was entirely severed. I predicted with chilling accuracy that his crippling financial terror would rapidly override any remaining trace of common sense. Entitlement breeds a very specific brand of criminal stupidity. He would inevitably rationalize that since he was my designated heir, the physical assets inside my home rightfully belonged to him. I did not install the cameras to protect my artwork or my electronics from common thieves. I installed the surveillance grid to legally capture my own flesh and blood, crossing the definitive line of no return. I sat in the hotel penthouse, staring at the dark screen of my tablet, waiting for his arrogance to spring the trap. The digital clock on my laptop screen silently rolled over to midnight. The sprawling city below the penthouse windows had settled into a quiet, rhythmic hum. Corinne was deeply asleep in the master bedroom, her steady breathing completely isolated from the impending catastrophe. I was reviewing a quarterly logistics report when the heavy tablet resting on the mahogany desk suddenly vibrated. The black screen instantly fractured into a brilliant, glaring red light. A severe, high-priority security alert pulsed across the display, accompanied by a silent digital notification. Multiple perimeter motion sensors at my suburban residence had just been violently triggered. I tapped the screen instantly, maximizing the live high-definition video feed. The infrared night vision clearly illuminated the secluded back patio of my home. 2 figures dressed in dark clothing were standing directly in front of the heavy, reinforced glass doors. They had bypassed the main driveway entirely, creeping through the dense tree line to avoid the exterior floodlights. I zoomed in on the crystalline footage, feeling a deep, physical coldness settle solidly into my chest. The digital lens perfectly captured Kendall's desperate, sweating face. Sloan stood anxiously over his shoulder, her designer jacket pulled tight against the midnight chill, constantly scanning the dark perimeter for any sign of neighbors or patrol cars. They were no longer behaving like entitled, demanding relatives negotiating for an unearned holiday feast. They were moving with the frantic, erratic energy of cornered animals. Kendall raised his hands, revealing a thick steel crowbar gripped tightly in his fists. He jammed the wedge of the heavy tool directly into the seam of the reinforced door frame. He threw his entire body weight against the steel lever, desperately straining against the commercial-grade locks I had personally installed. The glass groaned and shattered under the immense pressure. The heavy door splintered open, granting them immediate illegal access to the dark interior of my home. I watched my son physically cross the threshold, pulling his wife inside behind him. In that exact fraction of a second, the fundamental nature of our entire conflict permanently mutated. They had officially abandoned their fraudulent civil strategies and plunged headfirst into severe criminal territory. They were no longer simply greedy children throwing a legal tantrum over a canceled commercial lease. Kendall and Sloan had just willingly transformed themselves into active documented felons committing a premeditated home invasion. I pressed the record icon. The digital recording indicator pulsed a steady crimson on the top corner of my tablet screen. I sat in the absolute quiet of the penthouse suite and watched my flesh and blood desecrate the sanctuary of my home. The high-definition infrared cameras captured every frantic, destructive movement with surgical clarity. Kendall and Sloan did not hesitate in the hallway or pause to consider the monumental felony they had just committed by breaching the reinforced glass door. They moved with the aggressive, practiced synchronization of seasoned scavengers. Kendall headed straight for my private office, lugging a heavy canvas duffel bag over his shoulder. I tapped the screen to switch camera angles, following his path down the dark corridor. He dropped the bag onto my Persian rug and pulled out a cordless industrial angle grinder. He immediately approached the heavy steel safe embedded in the mahogany wall paneling. Sparks flew in a brilliant, chaotic cascade as the grinding disc bit into the reinforced locking mechanism. The sheer volume of the noise must have been deafening, but they clearly relied on the isolation of the estate and the late hour to mask their destruction. While Kendall viciously attacked the steel vault, I switched the feed to the adjacent study. Sloan was operating with an equal level of rabid desperation. She completely bypassed the valuable electronics and the displayed artwork. She was hunting for something far more specific. I watched her violently rip open the drawers of Corinne's antique writing desk. She callously tossed my wife's personal correspondence, carefully organized financial receipts, and cherished family photographs onto the hardwood floor. Sloan was frantically searching for the master copy of our last will and testament. She flipped through leather-bound folders with trembling hands, her eyes wide with a terrifying mixture of greed and pure panic. The sophisticated security microphones picked up her erratic, shallow breathing. She muttered curses under her breath every time a document turned out to be a simple utility bill or a meaningless warranty contract. She showed absolute disregard for the intimate history contained within that desk. The physical violation of my wife's personal space ignited a cold, hard fury deep within my chest. I remained perfectly still in my leather chair, drinking the last drop of my coffee. I deliberately allowed the advanced digital surveillance system to meticulously document every single agonizing second of their entirely unforgivable and utterly reckless betrayal. My son applied his entire body weight against the heavy industrial grinder, severing the final steel locking pins of the primary office safe. He kicked the smoldering metal door open, tossing the smoking power tool recklessly onto the carpet. He lunged forward, thrusting his hands into the dark internal cavity, absolutely certain he had just breached the central nervous system of my financial empire. He expected to uncover pristine stacks of bearer bonds, offshore account, routing ledgers, and unregistered property deeds. He firmly believed my immense wealth was tangible, stored inside the house like archaic pirate treasure. Instead, he pulled out 3 thick, dust-covered cardboard boxes. Kendall ripped the top flaps open, digging through the carefully bundled contents. I watched his feverish anticipation dissolve into utter crushing bewilderment. The grand prize for his aggressive nocturnal felony was nothing more than highly meticulous, deeply irrelevant corporate tax returns from the year 1998. He frantically overturned the remaining boxes, showering the floor with decades-old depreciation schedules and obsolete depreciation logs. The newly breached steel vault truly contained absolutely nothing of any actual liquid financial value. I am a man who constructs international supply chains. I do not leave the physical keys to my empire sitting behind a simple combination lock in a suburban home. My actual fortune was permanently secured inside an impenetrable blind trust over 15 years ago. I established an autonomous board of fiduciary directors who managed the vast majority of my holdings, ensuring that no single individual, including myself, could easily liquidate the primary estate without triggering massive, unavoidable legal alarms. Kendall possessed an incredibly infantile comprehension of true generational wealth. He operated under the profound delusion that control was defined by holding physical documents in his hands. He did not understand that real power is entirely invisible. It is woven directly into complex legal architectures secured behind impenetrable corporate firewalls and guarded by men like Mitchell who thrive entirely on relentless adversarial conflict. I had deliberately left that obsolete decoy safe in my office for exactly this kind of scenario. It was an essential psychological diversion explicitly designed to exhaust an intruder's energy and misdirect their focus away from anything actually sensitive. I watched Kendall angrily kick the empty cardboard boxes across the room. He screamed a vicious, echoing obscenity into the empty house, realizing he had just risked 20 years in federal prison for absolutely nothing. Kendall's outburst echoed down the dark hallway, drawing Sloane out from the adjacent study. She rushed into the office, her eyes wildly scanning the scattered cardboard boxes and the smoldering ruined safe. She demanded to know where the money was hidden, her voice high-pitched and completely devoid of rational control. Kendall shook his head frantically, explaining that the entire vault was a useless decoy. The profound disappointment on Sloane's face was immediately replaced by a ruthless, unyielding determination. She refused to leave the estate empty-handed. She dropped to her knees and began tearing through the bottom drawers of my heavy mahogany desk, indiscriminately throwing leather planners and expensive fountain pens onto the rug. I leaned closer to my tablet, watching her manic excavation with absolute unblinking focus. This was the precise moment my psychological trap was designed to spring. Buried beneath a stack of blank corporate stationery in the lowest, locked drawer was a very specific document. It was a flawless, highly detailed counterfeit bank statement I had personally commissioned before leaving for Florence. It was printed on authentic, watermarked financial parchment bearing the official logo of a prestigious international bank. The statement detailed a highly restricted, completely fictional offshore holding account containing exactly $3 million in unallocated cash reserves. Furthermore, the forged document included a very convincing set of routing codes and a simple, easily accessible authorization PIN. I watched the infrared camera feed as Sloane's manicured fingers finally grabbed the heavy parchment. She paused, her eyes scanning the prominent bold numbers printed across the top of the page. She stopped breathing for a fraction of a second. She slowly stood up and wordlessly handed the document directly to her husband. Kendall snatched the paper, his eyes widening to impossible proportions as he absorbed the manufactured financial data. The crushing defeat he experienced just moments earlier instantly vanished. In the pale green glow of the infrared night vision, I watched the two of them share a long, silent look of pure, rabid greed. They did not question the convenient placement of the document or the astonishing simplicity of the access codes. They were entirely blinded by their desperate need for immediate financial salvation. Kendall quickly folded the heavy counterfeit statement and immediately desperately shoved it deep inside his dark jacket pocket. The highly lethal financial bait was officially swallowed whole, firmly sealing their total, irreversible legal doom forever. The digital recording of my son committing a felony remained securely stored on my encrypted server. I did not sleep. I spent the remaining hours of the night finalizing the legal strike with ruthless precision. Before the first rays of the morning sun could pierce the heavy curtains of our downtown penthouse suite, a sharp, discreet knock echoed from the main door. I opened it to find Mitchell standing in the dimly lit corridor. He wore a tailored suit and carried his signature leather briefcase, looking entirely unaffected by the pre-dawn hour. He stepped inside without exchanging a single word of greeting and walked directly toward the massive marble kitchen island. Corinne was still asleep in the master bedroom, completely shielded from the corporate warfare unfolding in our temporary sanctuary. Mitchell unsnapped the brass clasps of his briefcase and withdrew a thick royal blue folder. He slid it across the cool marble surface until it stopped directly in front of me. I did not need to ask what it contained. Mitchell's presence at this hour indicated a catastrophic shift in our adversary's timeline. I opened the heavy cardstock cover and immediately analyzed the top document. It was a highly detailed financial summary compiled by Mitchell's forensic accounting team. Kendall had not wasted a single moment after discovering the counterfeit $3 million bank statement inside my decoy safe. The manufactured illusion of immense accessible liquid capital had triggered his most reckless instincts. Mitchell explained the mechanics of Kendall's immediate reaction. The 72-hour eviction notice Richard had served Sloan acted as a ticking time bomb. Facing the total public destruction of his wife's vanity boutique and falsely emboldened by the fake offshore account routing numbers in his pocket, Kendall had approached a predatory commercial lender. He urgently applied for a massive, high-interest business loan to instantly clear Sloan's toxic commercial debt and satisfy Richard's stringent lease requirements. He needed cash immediately and pursued a notoriously aggressive lending firm known for expediting massive payouts without asking tedious ethical questions. He executed this financial maneuver in a state of sheer blind panic, completely unaware that Mitchell's team was monitoring every single digital footprint he left behind in the financial sector. The blue folder contained the entirety of his desperate transaction. I stared intently at the irrefutable evidence proving that his absolute operational downfall was now officially secured and permanently inescapable from my unyielding iron grasp. Securing a loan of that staggering magnitude requires substantial verifiable collateral. A predatory lender demands absolute assurance that they can seize hard assets the moment a single payment is missed. Kendall's independent consulting firm possessed absolutely zero liquid capital to justify such a massive financial advance. His corporate accounts were entirely barren, and Sloan's boutique was already drowning in 6 figures of pre-existing liabilities. They had absolutely nothing of tangible value to offer the lending institution. Therefore, Kendall was forced to cross a terrifying financial boundary to satisfy the underwriter's demands. He bypassed standard banking protocols entirely and leveraged the only substantial asset he falsely believed he could control. He used my sprawling, fully paid-off suburban estate as the primary collateral for the high-interest commercial loan. I purchased that specific property over 3 decades ago. I paid for it entirely in cash following the successful acquisition of a major regional logistics competitor. It stood as a permanent mortgage-free monument to my early corporate victories. I intentionally kept the deed entirely unencumbered to ensure Corinne would always possess an absolute untouchable sanctuary regardless of any potential market volatility. Kendall was intimately aware of this financial reality. He knew the massive estate carried zero debt, making it an incredibly lucrative and highly attractive target for an aggressive commercial lender. His possession of the counterfeit offshore bank statement gave him a false sense of absolute invincibility. He rationalized that he could temporarily mortgage my pristine property, use the loan to rescue Sloan's failing retail business, and eventually pay off the massive predatory debt by siphoning funds from the fictional $3 million account he discovered in my decoy safe. He constructed a completely delusional financial house of cards, firmly believing he could manipulate my assets without triggering a single corporate alarm. He viewed my property strictly as a convenient stepping stone to preserve his wife's shallow social status. He demonstrated absolutely zero hesitation in risking the literal roof over his own mother's head simply to silence his immediate financial panic. The sheer unadulterated entitlement required to aggressively mortgage another man's home entirely without consent is profoundly staggering. He had fundamentally convinced himself that his highly privileged status as my sole legal heir granted him the ultimate unquestionable authority to secretly liquidate my personal sanctuary. He treated my lifelong professional achievements as a massive, unguarded piggy bank designed exclusively to continuously fund his arrogant, impulsive mistakes. I flipped to the final page of the comprehensive loan agreement contained within the blue folder. Mitchell watched me with the quiet, calculating intensity of a seasoned executioner waiting for the final command. The document required the explicit legally binding authorization of the primary property owner to formalize the massive transfer of commercial debt. I stared directly at the bottom right corner of the heavy parchment. Resting perfectly on the designated authorization line was my own signature. I scrutinized the ink strokes under the bright artificial lights of the penthouse kitchen. The penmanship was an incredibly clumsy, desperate imitation of my distinct corporate sign-off. Kendall had not merely manipulated a legal loophole or exploited a vague administrative technicality. He had forcefully grabbed a pen and actively committed blatant, undeniable forgery to push the fraudulent commercial loan through the final stages of approval. The physical evidence of his crime was now permanently inked into the official records of a heavily regulated financial institution. Mitchell leaned forward against the marble island, pointing specifically to the notary stamp embossed directly beside the falsified signature. Kendall had utilized a corrupt associate within his own consulting firm to illegally notarize the forged document, cementing his absolute culpability. The legal implications of this specific action were instantly devastating. Breaking a window and entering a house is a state-level burglary charge. Falsifying medical documents is a severe civil offense. However, actively forging a signature to secure a massive commercial loan against an unencumbered residential property crosses a massive, highly monitored boundary. Kendall had officially committed severe federal bank fraud. He had escalated his petty, greedy rebellion into a major criminal conspiracy carrying mandatory minimum federal prison sentences. He willingly handed me the exact weapon I needed to ensure his absolute permanent destruction. I closed the blue folder and pushed it back across the marble island toward my chief legal counsel. I did not raise my voice or display a single ounce of emotional distress. I instructed Mitchell to immediately compile the video footage of the home invasion, the fraudulent medical proxy, and the forged loan documents into a single cohesive prosecutorial package. The trap I meticulously engineered had completely snapped shut. My son had woven his own financial noose with staggering arrogance. I was now fully and absolutely prepared to mercilessly kick the fragile wooden stool completely out from directly beneath his arrogant, hopelessly dangling feet forever. The morning sun crept across the polished floor of the penthouse suite as I finalized the next phase of my precise strategy. Kendall had willingly slipped his head into the noose by leveraging my property with a forged signature. Now it was time to lead him directly to the gallows. I contacted a highly exclusive bonded courier service renowned for handling sensitive corporate documents. I provided them with a thick, heavy parchment envelope embossed with my personal monogram and secured with a deep crimson wax seal. The presentation was deliberately archaic and dripping with an imposing level of formal authority. I instructed the courier to deliver the package directly into Kendall's hands at his suburban residence. The physical delivery was a calculated psychological maneuver. Kendall was currently operating in a state of manic euphoria, entirely convinced he had successfully bypassed my security and outsmarted me with his fraudulent commercial loan. The heavy wax-sealed envelope would validate his grandest delusions of victory. Inside the envelope rested a single, elegantly typeset invitation. It requested the formal presence of Kendall and his wife at a private dining room inside the city's most historically exclusive culinary institution. The restaurant was a formidable bastion of old money, a place where reservations required months of notice and absolute social pedigree. I had secured their premier private chamber through a massive, unhesitating cash expenditure. The brief text printed on the invitation was engineered with surgical precision. It did not offer apologies or demand explanations. It simply stated that the dinner was convened for the explicit purpose of finalizing the estate transition. I knew exactly how my son's compromised, greedy mind would interpret those specific words. He would instantly assume I had surrendered. He would believe that my silence over the past week was a sign of absolute defeat, and that I was officially summoning him to formalize the transfer of the fictional $3 million he had discovered in my decoy safe. The invitation would act as the ultimate confirmation of his manufactured triumph. He would perceive the luxurious venue as the rightful stage for his ascension to the head of the family empire. I tracked the courier's progress via a secure digital link on my tablet. The notification chimed, confirming a direct hand-to-hand delivery at Kendall's front door. The bait had been beautifully presented, and I knew with absolute certainty he would be completely incapable of resisting the profound allure of his own perceived victory. The invitation contained a secondary, highly specific directive that I knew would guarantee a spectacular implosion. I explicitly mandated the attendance of Sloane's parents. The inclusion of my in-laws was not a gesture of family unity. It was a deliberate, tactical clustering of my adversaries. Arthur and Beatrice operated as relentless social climbers within the city's affluent circles. They possessed inherited wealth that was rapidly dwindling, yet they viciously maintained a facade of aristocratic superiority. From the very day Kendall introduced Sloane into our family, her parents had treated me with a thinly veiled, highly polished contempt. They looked down on my working-class roots with absolute disdain. They frequently made condescending remarks regarding my early years driving delivery trucks and building a logistics empire from the ground up. To them, My calloused hands and lack of generational pedigree made me fundamentally inferior. Regardless of the massive fortune I had accumulated, they viewed my son entirely as a financial lifeboat, a convenient mechanism to permanently secure their daughter's fragile social standing. I had endured their sneering arrogance for years, maintaining a polite, impenetrable silence for the sake of family harmony. That harmony was now officially terminated. I knew the moment Sloane informed her parents about the fictional $3 million offshore account, their elitist disdain would instantly evaporate, replaced by ravenous, unadulterated greed. The prospect of securing a massive immediate cash infusion would completely override their snobbery. They would view the invitation as the definitive moment their daughter inherited the ultimate prize. They would eagerly don their finest tailored clothing and rush to the exclusive restaurant, desperately terrified of missing out on their share of the corporate spoils. Arthur and Beatrice firmly believed they were the intellectual superiors in any room they occupied. They were utterly convinced that my working-class background meant I was entirely incapable of executing a sophisticated, multi-layered strategic deception. They assumed I was a blunt instrument easily manipulated by their daughter's refined social maneuvering. By demanding their presence at the dinner, I was ensuring that the architects of Sloane's toxic entitlement were placed directly in the blast radius of her impending destruction. They needed to be physically present to witness the absolute obliteration of the financial safety net they had so ruthlessly exploited. The audience for the final execution was now fully assembled, driven by a blinding greed that completely neutralized their basic survival instincts. With the invitation successfully delivered and the targets aggressively moving into position, I turned my attention back to the operational mechanics of the strike. Mitchell arrived at the penthouse exactly at noon, carrying a secure hard drive that contained the absolute totality of our counteroffensive. We sat at the mahogany desk overlooking the bustling city streets, reviewing the digital arsenal piece by piece. The criminal indictment files were fully prepared, comprehensively documented, and currently sitting in an encrypted digital queue. Mitchell had systematically organized the raw data into a flawless, inescapable prosecutorial narrative. The package included the high-definition infrared video of Kendall violently breaching the back door of my estate with a steel crowbar. It contained the time-stamped audio recordings of Sloane tearing apart Corinne's private desk in her manic search for my last will and testament. Most importantly, it featured the certified banking records proving Kendall had leveraged my unencumbered property using a blatant, amateurish forgery of my legal signature. He had committed textbook federal bank fraud, and the evidence was absolutely irrefutable. Mitchell confirmed that his extensive network of contacts within the federal prosecutor's office and the local law enforcement agencies were standing by on high alert. The digital queue was meticulously programmed. Upon my specific command, the secure server would simultaneously blast the comprehensive evidence package to the relevant authorities, instantly triggering a massive coordinated criminal investigation. There would be no opportunity for Kendall to negotiate a civil settlement or quietly untangle his fraudulent commercial loan. The resulting legal avalanche would crush his consulting firm, seize his assets, and practically guarantee a lengthy federal prison sentence. Mitchell looked across the desk, his expression a mask of pure, clinical professionalism. He asked for the final confirmation to arm the automated digital delivery system. I did not hesitate for a fraction of a second. I looked at the undeniable proof of my son's monstrous betrayal, feeling nothing but a cold, absolute resolve. I gave Mitchell the green light to prepare the strike. He entered a complex alphanumeric sequence into his encrypted terminal, officially locking the catastrophic data package into the launch sequence. The heavy machinery of absolute justice was now fully armed and humming with lethal potential. I stood up from the desk and walked toward the expansive penthouse window, gazing down at the ignorant city below. The final spectacular act of destruction was perfectly aligned. The atmosphere inside the VIP dining room of the city's most exclusive restaurant was suffocatingly heavy. The air was dead quiet save for the faint clinking of crystal glasses and the muted hum of classical music drifting from the main floor. The private chamber was an opulent display of mahogany and gold designed explicitly to intimidate. I sat at the head of the long table, observing my adversaries with cold detachment. Sloane's parents, Arthur and Beatrice, sat directly across from me with their arms tightly crossed. Their expressions were masks of smug, unearned superiority. They projected the aura of royalty, gracing a peasant with their presence. Beside them sat Sloane, radiating a toxic, frantic energy. She was wearing a newly purchased, staggeringly expensive designer dress that clearly cost more than a standard luxury vehicle. It was a brazen, reckless purchase, undoubtedly financed by the counterfeit bank statement her husband had stolen from my decoy safe. She sipped her champagne with a trembling hand, her eyes darting around the room with feverish anticipation. She looked less like a sophisticated entrepreneur and more like a starving animal cornered near a fresh carcass. Kendall sat to her right, aggressively projecting the false, hollow confidence of a victorious chief executive officer who had just executed a flawless corporate takeover. He leaned back in his plush leather chair, swirling his expensive bourbon, entirely convinced he was the master of the universe. He smiled a thin, arrogant smile that completely masked the sheer, undeniable reality of his impending doom. He truly believed he had outmaneuvered a man who had built international logistics empires from dust. He assumed my silence over the past 48 hours was a clear signal of absolute surrender. He thought the wax-sealed invitation was my formal capitulation to his manufactured brilliance. The four of them sat in a tight, united cluster of deceit, exchanging victorious glances and waiting for me to officially hand over the keys to my estate. They had arrived early, eager to claim their unearned prize. I watched them bask in their shared delusion, taking a slow sip of sparkling water. The trap had been flawlessly set, and the prey had marched willingly into the center of the crosshairs. The silence stretched on, thickening the tension in the room. They were expecting a defeated old man. They were completely unprepared for the absolute reality of their extremely bleak situation here today. Arthur and Beatrice had spent their entire adult lives meticulously cultivating an illusion of aristocratic grandeur. Their family wealth had steadily eroded over 3 generations of profound financial mismanagement and unchecked frivolous spending. Despite their heavily leveraged country club memberships and rapidly decaying trust funds, they continued to look down upon my working-class roots. I built my massive logistics empire through decades of grueling manual labor, strategic risk, and unyielding discipline. They viewed my calloused hands as a permanent mark of intellectual inferiority. In their highly warped social perspective, new money was inherently subordinate to inherited pedigree. When Kendall married Sloane, they did not see a union of 2 young professionals. They saw an immediate lucrative opportunity to finally stabilize their collapsing financial foundation by quietly attaching their daughter to my immense corporate treasury. Tonight, they firmly believed their long-term parasitical strategy had reached its ultimate culmination. The 2 in-laws were utterly convinced that my sudden decision to convene this luxurious private dinner proved I had finally surrendered to the sheer overwhelming pressure of their supposedly superior social status. They had severely underestimated my cognitive endurance, viewing my advancing age as a definitive indicator of inevitable rapid submission to their much younger influence. Arthur assumed that a man entering his late 60s would naturally lack the stamina required to sustain a prolonged corporate war against a highly motivated younger generation. Beatrice operated under the profound delusion that Corinne and I were simply too tired to fight back, too exhausted by the relentless holiday drama to protect our own assets. They genuinely believed I was desperately seeking a peaceful retirement and was entirely willing to sacrifice my entire estate just to maintain a quiet, harmonious relationship with my only son and his demanding wife. The fictional $3 million offshore account Kendall had discovered inside my decoy safe completely cemented their arrogant assumptions. They thought I had secretly hoarded those funds and was now terrified that Kendall's fraudulent medical proxy would expose my hidden wealth to federal regulators. They interpreted my silence as profound, paralyzing fear. They sat in their expensive chairs sipping vintage wine, entirely certain that they had mentally broken a hardened industry titan. They viewed the upcoming surrender of my estate as a natural transfer of power, a rightful passing of the torch from an exhausted inferior laborer to the vastly superior, infinitely more capable minds of the modern elite. The suffocating silence in the dining room was finally broken by Arthur. He cleared his throat with an exaggerated theatrical cough designed to draw all attention toward his position at the table. He reached inside the breast pocket of his tailored blazer and produced a thick, professionally bound legal document. He placed it squarely on the mahogany table and firmly slid the comprehensive power of attorney directly across the polished surface until it rested perfectly aligned in front of my hands. Arthur leaned forward, steepled his fingers, and projected an expression of profound, deeply fake compassion. He confidently stated that the sudden transition of immense wealth could be incredibly overwhelming for a man entering the twilight years of his life. He condescendingly patted the heavy cardstock cover and explicitly instructed me to sign away all control of my entire estate. He claimed it was absolutely imperative to transfer my assets immediately so that vastly more capable, highly educated minds could efficiently manage the complex wealth. He tapped the blank signature line with his expensive fountain pen, demanding I execute the legal transition without any further dramatic resistance. Sloane smiled a venomous, triumphant smile, already visually calculating the staggering renovations she planned to commission for her boutique. Kendall sat completely still, barely able to contain his euphoric anticipation. They were entirely oblivious to the lethal reality surrounding them. They believed the thick document sitting on the table represented their absolute salvation. I looked down at the blank signature line, feeling a cold, dark satisfaction settle into my chest. I did not reach for the pen. Instead, I calmly reached into my own interior jacket pocket and withdrew my encrypted mobile phone. I held the device in my palm, my thumb hovering precisely over the primary execution icon. Mitchell had confirmed just 30 minutes prior that the massive criminal indictment files were fully prepared, completely synchronized, and actively sitting in the secure digital queue. All federal prosecutors and local law enforcement agencies were standing by on high alert. The completely devastating digital avalanche was completely ready to deploy. I looked directly into Kendall's expectant, greedy eyes, offering him one final, terrifyingly blank stare. I calmly pressed the illuminated screen. I gave the absolute green light to initiate the legal strike. The absolute destruction of my son's life was now officially launched. The entirely merciless, highly permanent correction had finally arrived here tonight. The suffocating silence of the private dining chamber hung heavily in the air as Arthur pushed the fraudulent power of attorney document closer to my hands. He tapped his expensive fountain pen against the signature line, his eyes gleaming with the predatory anticipation of a man who believed he had just conquered an empire. Beatrice adjusted her diamond necklace, practically vibrating with unearned triumph. Sloane and Kendall sat rigidly, their faces locked in expressions of arrogant expectation. They were waiting for my complete capitulation. They expected me to lower my head, pick up the pen, and legally transfer my entire life's work into their undeserving hands. I did not even look at the document. I looked directly past Arthur's smug expression and raised my right hand, snapping my fingers with a sharp, echoing crack that instantly broke the heavy silence of the room. The head waiter, who had been standing discreetly near the mahogany doors, immediately rushed to our table. I did not ask for dessert or offer a celebratory toast to my newly appointed successors. I instructed the waiter to bring the final bill for the entire evening. Arthur blinked in sudden confusion, his confident smile faltering for a fraction of a second. He attempted to interject, undoubtedly assuming I was simply clearing the administrative details before executing the ultimate financial transition. I completely ignored his stuttering protests. When the waiter presented the leather folio containing the exorbitant receipt, I reached into the interior pocket of my tailored coat. I bypassed my standard corporate accounts and withdrew a solid, heavy black titanium card. The metallic thud of the card hitting the polished table resonated with undeniable authority. It was a tier of financial leverage Arthur and Beatrice had only read about in financial magazines, a physical manifestation of a net worth they could never truly comprehend. The waiter processed the transaction with quiet reverence and returned the card. I placed it back into my pocket and slowly stood up from my leather chair. I looked down at the fabricated power of attorney document resting near my plate. With a dismissive flick of my wrist, I pushed it off the edge of the table, letting it flutter uselessly onto the floor. I reached back into my coat and retrieved a thick, heavily stamped manila folder. I raised it high before slamming it violently onto the exact center of the table. The sharp impact of the heavy folder striking the mahogany wood echoed through the dining room like a gunshot. Arthur physically recoiled, pulling his hands away from the table, as if the document were laced with poison. The thick dossier was not a transfer of offshore funds or a capitulation of my corporate assets. It was the finalized court-ordered commercial eviction notice for Sloane's luxury fashion boutique. 72 hours ago, my former business associate, Richard Thorne, had dispatched his enforcer to serve Sloane with a preliminary default warning. She had spent the last 3 days operating under the profound delusion that she could outsmart the legal realities of commercial real estate. She firmly believed that Kendall's fraudulent high-interest business loan would successfully clear her massive financial liabilities before Richard could officially seize the property. She completely failed to understand that the loan was permanently stalled, frozen by the federal bank fraud investigation I had just triggered from my encrypted mobile device. Without that desperately needed injection of stolen capital, Sloan had absolutely nothing to offer her landlord. Richard Thorne is a man who operates with brutal, uncompromising efficiency. He does not grant extensions, he does not accept apologies, and he certainly does not tolerate arrogant tenants occupying his premium retail properties without a verified financial guarantor. The exact second her 72-hour grace period expired, Richard's legal team immediately filed an emergency petition with the county judge. Given her six-figure debt and the total absence of my financial backing, the presiding judge granted the immediate seizure of the commercial premises without a single moment of hesitation. The front page of the dossier bore the undeniable, deeply embossed red stamp of the county sheriff's execution department. For 3 years, Sloan had utilized that high-end boutique as a weapon of social dominance. She had leveraged my wealth to secure the lease, intentionally erasing my involvement while portraying herself as a brilliant, self-made entrepreneur to her superficial social circle. She had repeatedly demanded that Corinne serve her wealthy friends, treating my wife like hired help to validate her manufactured success. She built her entire identity upon a foundation that I had personally poured and maintained. I had quietly removed that foundational pillar, and now the entire structure was collapsing upon her head. The heavy red seal of the county sheriff's office represented the absolute, entirely permanent termination of her highly arrogant, unearned corporate fantasy. Sloan stared at the thick folder, her manicured fingers trembling violently against the edge of the mahogany table. Driven by a blinding combination of greed and desperation, she lunged forward and aggressively ripped the manila envelope open. She genuinely expected to find the routing numbers for the fictional $3 million offshore account she had discovered during her felony home invasion. Instead, her eyes locked onto the stark, bold lettering of the judicial order. The remaining color instantly drained from her heavily contoured face, leaving her completely ashen. She read the dense legal text, her breath catching sharply in her throat as she processed the absolute reality of her situation. The judicial mandate was unequivocally clear. The document explicitly ordered her to entirely vacate the commercial premises by exactly 8 a.m. tomorrow. Furthermore, the order stipulated that if she failed to remove her physical presence by the stated deadline, the county sheriff's department would immediately change the exterior locks and permanently seize her entire inventory to cover the outstanding financial penalties. Her meticulously crafted illusion of extreme wealth and sophisticated business acumen shattered into 1,000 jagged pieces. The unearned arrogance she had projected just moments earlier instantly dissolved into sheer, unadulterated terror. She dropped the heavy parchment onto the table as if it had physically burned her flesh. Kendall aggressively snatched the document from the table, his eyes frantically scanning the sheriff's seal and the judge's signature. His confident posture completely collapsed, his shoulders slumping as he realized his fraudulent commercial loan had failed to process. Beatrice and Arthur leaned forward, their expressions shifting from aristocratic smugness to absolute confusion. Arthur demanded to know why I was presenting eviction notices instead of signing the estate transfer. He haughtily insisted that this was a wildly inappropriate time to discuss trivial lease disputes. I looked down at the four of them, feeling the immense crushing weight of absolute justice settle into the room. They had arrived at this exclusive restaurant entirely convinced they were attending a banquet celebrating their ultimate victory over an exhausted old man. They were now realizing, with paralyzing, horrifying clarity, that they had actually walked directly into a meticulously prepared execution chamber. Sloan buried her face in her hands, releasing a sudden involuntary sob that echoed through the quiet dining room. The relentless, merciless process of their absolute financial and social eradication had finally reached its ultimate inescapable conclusion. Arthur slammed his hands onto the polished mahogany surface, his chair scraping violently against the hardwood floor as he abruptly stood. The deep red flush of unadulterated indignation crawled rapidly up his neck, modeling his usually composed aristocratic features. He was a man accustomed to bullying his way through minor social inconveniences, using his fading pedigree as a blunt instrument. He pointed a trembling manicured finger directly at my face. He loudly declared that my actions were not merely insulting, but constituted egregious legal harassment. He promised to unleash a legion of corporate litigators upon my estate. He threatened me with crippling defamation lawsuits, claiming I had maliciously orchestrated the destruction of his daughter's reputation. He shouted that I had absolutely no right to summon them under the guise of an estate transition, only to subject them to a petty vindictive display of commercial eviction. His voice echoed harshly in the oppressive silence of the VIP dining room, but his blustering threats lacked any actual substance. He was projecting the frantic, hollow aggression of a man who suddenly realized he was standing on quicksand. Beatrice chimed in, her voice shrill and trembling, demanding that Kendall immediately call their private attorneys to halt this unprecedented outrage. Kendall remained entirely mute, his eyes glued to the sheriff's seal on the eviction notice. He knew my capabilities far better than his arrogant in-laws. He understood that I never initiate a confrontation without possessing absolute, overwhelming leverage. I did not raise my voice to match Arthur's frantic screaming. I did not offer a single word in my own defense. I simply rested my right hand on the mahogany table and tapped my index finger against the wood exactly twice. The sharp, rhythmic sound instantly cut through Arthur's hysterical legal threats. The heavy double doors connecting the private dining room to the adjacent parlor swung open silently. Mitchell stepped over the threshold, moving with the cold, measured efficiency of a predator entering a secured hunting ground. He did not acknowledge the shouting or the palpable panic radiating from the opposite side of the table. He carried a sleek silver laptop under his arm. He walked directly toward the large digital display screen mounted seamlessly into the far wall of the dining chamber. The sudden, unannounced arrival of my chief legal counsel instantly suffocated Arthur's tirade, replacing his fabricated outrage with a profound, entirely terrifying uncertainty. Mitchell connected a discreet encrypted cable from his silver laptop directly into the communications port of the mounted wall monitor. The massive digital screen flickered to life, immediately replacing the restaurant's ambient visual artwork with the crystal-clear interface of my private surveillance network. Mitchell executed 3 rapid keystrokes. The pristine 4K resolution security footage from my suburban estate instantly dominated the entire room. The uncompressed audio feed surged through the high-fidelity surround sound speakers embedded in the dining room ceiling. The violent, high-pitched screech of an industrial angle grinder tearing through solid steel suddenly shattered the elegant silence. Arthur and Beatrice physically flinched, their hands flying to their ears to block out the horrific mechanical noise. On the glowing screen, bathed in the eerie green tint of military-grade infrared night vision, Kendall was furiously attacking the door of my decoy safe. I had meticulously anticipated this exact manifestation of their deeply rooted entitlement. The massive steel vault embedded in my office wall was entirely theatrical, a deliberate security honeypot placed there solely to tempt any impulsive infiltrator. Decades ago, I realized that true wealth cannot be protected by mere physical barriers or simple combination locks. Physical assets can always be compromised by a desperate individual wielding heavy tools and possessing a severe moral deficit. Therefore, my genuine financial architecture was completely decentralized. The true power of my entire estate was thoroughly insulated within an invisible labyrinth of corporate shell companies offshore, holding accounts and heavily fortified blind trusts. The physical vault, currently being destroyed on the large screen, contained absolutely nothing but obsolete depreciation schedules and worthless decades-old tax returns. I intentionally designed that specific room to serve as an attractive vulnerability. I am a man who leaves absolutely nothing to chance. I construct traps that force my adversaries to willingly document their own psychological degradation. Mitchell maximized the digital feed displaying Kendall throwing his entire body weight against the smoking steel door. The sparks cascaded beautifully across the screen, illuminating the sheer madness contorting my son's sweating face. He looked like a ravenous scavenger tearing into a carcass, completely unaware that his violent actions were being perfectly preserved in high definition. The audio shifted abruptly as the heavy steel door finally gave way, clanging loudly against the floorboards. The horrible grinding noise was immediately replaced by the frantic sounds of cardboard boxes being ripped apart by his greedy hands. Mitchell seamlessly switched the camera angle on the massive digital display. The perspective shifted to the adjacent study, instantly projecting Sloane onto the restaurant wall. She was violently ripping through my wife's antique writing desk, indiscriminately throwing intimate personal correspondence directly onto the floor. Beatrice gasped audibly, covering her mouth with her hands as she watched her daughter aggressively ransacking a private residence. The high-definition audio flawlessly captured Sloane cursing wildly, demanding to know where the hidden money was located. Arthur sat absolutely paralyzed in his leather chair. The false aristocratic superiority he had proudly weaponized against me completely evaporated. His face went entirely pale, completely drained of the furious red indignation he had exhibited only moments earlier. He slowly lowered his hands, refusing to meet my unyielding gaze. They watched in sheer, unadulterated horror as their beloved daughter legally crossed the definitive threshold from greedy opportunist to an active, fully documented felon. Every single one of their blustering legal threats instantly died in their throats. The video proved their daughter had willingly committed severe premeditated burglary. They suddenly realized the staggering gravity of their immediate situation. They were not sitting across from a defeated, compliant victim willing to surrender his entire estate for a few moments of suburban peace. They were sharing a table with a highly calculating adversary who currently held the physical keys to their only daughter's federal prison cell. The power dynamics inside the VIP dining room violently inverted. Kendall remained completely silent, unable to tear his eyes away from the digital monitor. The video feed clearly showed him frantically digging through the destroyed safe, visibly pulling out the counterfeit offshore bank statement. I watched Arthur's eyes widen as he recognized the forged document his son-in-law had gleefully presented to them earlier that week. He finally comprehended the sheer terrifying depth of my strategic retaliation. I had deliberately fed their catastrophic entitlement, allowing them to greedily construct their own impenetrable legal trap. I leaned slightly forward, resting my elbows firmly on the polished mahogany table. I looked directly at Arthur, observing the absolute destruction of his fragile social facade. I did not need to raise my voice or offer any grand theatrical declarations. The undeniable visual evidence radiating from the monitor explicitly conveyed the absolute undeniable truth. The silent correction was finally and fully executed, entirely and completely locking them inside a merciless, inescapable reality forever. The silence following the video presentation was absolute, suffocating the room under the sheer weight of undeniable guilt. Kendall's chest heaved erratically as his eyes darted from the digital monitor to my completely impassive face. He practically choked on his own saliva as he desperately attempted to construct a viable defense. He stammered wildly, his voice cracking an octave higher than normal, claiming he was simply attempting to locate crucial missing tax documents that I had supposedly misplaced. He suggested the aggressive breach of the safe was merely a dramatic misunderstanding born from a place of deep administrative concern. He possessed the profound audacity to frame his felony destruction of my property as a misguided act of filial duty. I did not allow his pathetic, cowardly rationalization to breathe for a single second. I cut him down with clinical, unyielding precision. I stated clearly that corporate tax documents are typically requested via a secure email to a certified public accountant, rather than violently extracted from a decoy vault using an industrial angle grinder at 3 a.m. His weak, trembling voice instantly died in his throat. He shrank back into his plush leather chair, realizing the utter futility of his transparent lies. I reached back into my coat pocket and retrieved the final, definitive piece of physical evidence. It was the heavily stapled, multi-page commercial bank loan application. I held it up briefly, allowing the harsh restaurant lighting to illuminate the blue seal of the predatory lending firm he had blindly trusted. Without a single word of prolonged explanation, I dropped the forged application directly over the center of Arthur's fraudulent power of attorney document. The heavy thud of the paper striking the mahogany table served as the final nail in my son's hastily constructed coffin. The crisp, white pages explicitly displayed the unencumbered deed to my suburban estate, listed shamelessly as the primary collateral for a massive, high-interest financial advance. Kendall's eyes widened in sheer, paralyzing horror as he recognized the specific legal packet. He knew instantly that I possessed the complete, unredacted record of his ultimate betrayal. The paper resting on the table completely dismantled any remaining illusion of a minor family dispute. It instantly elevated the situation from a civil disagreement into a major, highly documented criminal offense. The steel trap had fully snapped shut around his arrogant neck. I leaned forward, placing my hands flat against the table, and systematically articulated the severe legal reality of his actions. I explained that exploiting a momentary family vulnerability to steal petty cash constitutes basic theft. However, actively forging a primary property owner's signature to illegally secure a massive commercial loan against a fully paid residential estate crosses a highly monitored, fiercely protected boundary. By transmitting those fraudulent documents across state lines to a commercial lending institution, Kendall had officially committed severe federal wire fraud. This was not a minor infraction that could be quietly swept under the rug with a modest fine or a period of supervised probation. It was a major felony that triggered mandatory minimum sentencing guidelines and guaranteed aggressive federal prosecution. He had utilized a corrupt associate within his own firm to illegally notarize the documents, actively constructing a documented criminal conspiracy. The federal government possesses a terrifyingly low tolerance for individuals who manipulate the banking system using counterfeit collateral. Kendall stared at the forged signature resting on the table, his face draining of all remaining color as the sheer magnitude of his impending incarceration finally registered in his mind. Arthur and Beatrice sat frozen in their seats, their previous aristocratic arrogance completely replaced by the horrifying realization that their daughter was actively married to a documented felon. They recognized that their own social standing was about to be utterly annihilated by association. I maintained eye contact with Kendall, ensuring he understood the fundamental shift in our dynamic. For his entire life, he had viewed me as a passive provider, a bottomless financial reservoir designed exclusively to absorb the consequences of his endless, arrogant mistakes. He fundamentally believed I was a soft, easily manipulated victim. I clarified my position with absolute chilling certainty. I engineered this entire scenario from the very moment I discovered the counterfeit bank statement in my safe. I intentionally left the vault vulnerable. I deliberately allowed him to execute the loan application without interference. I meticulously documented every single step of his financial suicide. I am not a helpless victim waiting for salvation. I am the architect of his absolute downfall. I am the executioner, and I hold the undeniable authority to permanently terminate his professional and personal existence. He handed me the exact weapon I needed, and I was fully prepared to finally swing the axe. The absolute panic radiating from Kendall was palpable, a suffocating aura of total defeat that completely filled the opulent dining chamber. He opened his mouth to plead for mercy, but I raised my hand, immediately silencing his pathetic attempt at negotiation. I did not convene this gathering to entertain his empty apologies or listen to his desperate bargaining. I brought him here to present him with a singular non-negotiable ultimatum. I signaled to Mitchell, who smoothly extracted a final slim document from his leather briefcase and placed it directly in front of my trembling son. The contract was stark, brutal, and utterly uncompromising. I calmly instructed Kendall to read the primary clause. He was required to instantly sign over 100% equity of his independent financial consulting firm directly to my holding company. I demanded total ownership of his corporate entity, his client list, his intellectual property, and every single liquid asset tied to his business name. This aggressive corporate seizure was specifically calculated to systematically liquidate his entire professional identity. The transferred assets would be immediately utilized to aggressively cover the stolen funds, satisfy the massive penalties associated with Sloan's commercial eviction, and completely clear the toxic forged loan he had attached to my residential property. He would walk away from this table with absolutely nothing but the expensive suit currently resting upon his shoulders. He would be entirely stripped of his title, his income, and his manufactured prestige. Kendall stared at the transfer agreement, his hands shaking violently as the reality of his total financial ruin crashed down upon him. He looked toward Arthur and Beatrice for support, but his in-laws sharply averted their eyes, entirely unwilling to associate with a sinking ship. They had already mentally discarded him to preserve their own fragile status. I leaned closer, lowering my voice to a cold, razor-sharp whisper that sliced through the ambient restaurant noise. I informed him that the digital evidence package compiled by my legal team was currently locked in an automated queue. If he refused to sign the equity transfer agreement right now, or if he attempted to delay the process by a single hour, the entire unredacted file would be instantly transmitted to the regional director of the Federal Bureau of Investigation precisely at dawn. He faced a brutal choice: absolute financial poverty or an immediate guaranteed federal prison sentence. The oppressive reality of the federal ultimatum hung over the table like a physical weight. Sloan finally broke. The meticulously maintained facade of the sophisticated, untouchable socialite shattered, completely replaced by raw, unadulterated panic. She let out a sharp, hysterical sob that tore through the refined acoustics of the private dining room. Her hands trembling so violently they knocked over a crystal water goblet shot across the mahogany table and clamped firmly onto Arthur's tailored sleeve. She begged him with a pathetic, high-pitched desperation, her voice entirely stripped of its usual haughty cadence. She pleaded with her father to simply pull out his checkbook and instantly buy their way out of this nightmare. She begged him to immediately cover the stolen funds, to pay off the fraudulent commercial loan, and to salvage her sinking vanity boutique before the county sheriff arrived at dawn to bolt the doors permanently. She rationalized, through a stream of incoherent tears, that a few $1,000,000 was a meaningless sum for a family of their established pedigree. She clutched the lapel of his expensive blazer, staining the pristine fabric with her running makeup, entirely convinced that her parents would naturally deploy their generational wealth to shield her from the devastating consequences of her husband's federal crimes. She believed she could simply be purchased out of her own destruction. Arthur looked down at his daughter's manicured fingers digging into his clothing. He did not project the warm, reassuring presence of a protective patriarch. His face, still flushed with the initial shock of the surveillance footage, twisted into a mask of pure visceral revulsion. He acted as if Sloane had suddenly contracted a highly contagious, lethal disease. With a sharp, aggressive motion, he brought his opposite hand down and forcibly pried her fingers off his suit. He physically shoved her hands away, smoothing his wrinkled sleeve with a frantic, obsessive urgency. He did not offer a single word of comfort or a promise of financial salvation. He looked at her with a cold, piercing disdain that instantly halted her hysterical sobbing. The rejection was absolute and violently physical. Sloane fell back into her leather chair, her mouth hanging open in stunned silence as the terrible realization washed over her. The financial safety net she had always relied upon, the bottomless well of parental resources she had arrogantly flaunted her entire life, had just been completely and mercilessly severed right before her very own eyes. To understand Arthur and Beatrice's immediate brutal withdrawal, one must fully understand the shallow currency they truly traded in. Their familial loyalty was never an unconditional bond. It extended only as far as their highly curated, rigorously polished public image would safely allow. Their entire existence was built upon a precarious, crumbling foundation of social perception and strict country club elitism. They operated exclusively within affluent circles, where personal financial ruin was quietly considered a tragic misfortune, but public criminal scandal was an unforgivable, permanent excommunication. Their aristocratic superiority was largely a theatrical performance, designed to deliberately mask the rapidly accelerating decay of their own inherited trust funds. They simply did not possess the immense liquid capital required to instantly vaporize Kendall's multi-million-dollar federal wire fraud or salvage Sloane's disastrous commercial lease. Even if they somehow had access to those specific corporate funds, deploying them to rescue a son-in-law facing mandatory federal prison sentences would be an act of complete social suicide. They were highly experienced parasites, perfectly willing to happily attach themselves to a thriving host, but they possessed a ruthless, undeniable instinct for abandoning a sinking ship the absolute second the hull was critically breached. Faced with the undeniable high-definition reality of federal bank fraud, severe property crimes, and impending public humiliation, their base instinct for total self-preservation completely overrode any lingering remnants of parental affection. They looked at Kendall not as a temporarily misguided son, but as a highly toxic liability who was actively dragging their pristine family name directly into a massive federal indictment. Beatrice gripped her expensive clutch purse with white-knuckled intensity, her eyes darting toward the heavy mahogany doors, as if actively calculating the fastest possible escape route. She had spent decades meticulously maneuvering her daughter into advantageous social positions, viewing Sloane's marriage to my sole heir as the ultimate permanently secure investment. Now that specific investment had violently defaulted, exposing them to the absolute worst kind of catastrophic public scandal. They understood with chilling clarity that associating with Kendall's corporate forgery and Sloane's documented burglary would inevitably invite relentless media scrutiny, aggressive federal audits, and immediate expulsion from their elite social sanctuaries. They were completely unwilling to sacrifice their own fragile social standing to absorb the collateral damage of their daughter's catastrophic greed. The unconditional love Sloane had always arrogantly assumed was her inherent birthright was officially exposed as a highly conditional, strictly transactional arrangement that had just suffered a total, irreversible cancellation. Arthur slowly pushed his heavy leather chair back from the table, the wooden legs scraping harshly against the floor. He stood up, adjusting his suit jacket with a final definitive tug that officially signaled the absolute end of the negotiation. Beatrice immediately mirrored his movements, rising swiftly to her feet without sparing a single glance in her devastated daughter's direction. They did not attempt to address me directly, nor did they issue any further blustering legal threats. They recognized that the entire battlefield had been completely mined and that remaining in the room for another minute would only ensure their own immediate destruction. Arthur looked down at Kendall, delivering a gaze so entirely devoid of basic empathy it chilled the ambient air inside the luxurious room. He stated in a voice completely stripped of any familial warmth that they would not be drawn into a massive federal criminal conspiracy under any circumstances. He formally announced that they were officially severing all ties with this specific situation, and strongly advised Kendall to immediately secure his own criminal defense counsel before the authorities arrived. With that final devastating pronouncement, Arthur turned sharply on his heel. He placed his hand firmly on the polished brass handle of the heavy mahogany door and pushed it open. Beatrice followed directly behind him, her heels clicking a sharp, rapid retreat across the beautiful hardwood floor. They walked out of the private dining room and disappeared into the bustling corridor, completely refusing to look back even once. They abandoned their only daughter and their disgraced son-in-law to the absolute slaughter without a fraction of hesitation or remorse. The heavy doors swung shut behind them, sealing the VIP chamber in a profound, suffocating silence. Sloane let out a hollow, broken gasp, her eyes wide with the sheer terror of total, unexpected abandonment. She looked at the empty space where her parents had just been sitting, finally comprehending the absolute permanence of her sudden isolation. Kendall remained completely frozen in his seat, his hands resting limply near the forged commercial loan documents and the aggressive corporate seizure contract. The manufactured confidence, the smug entitlement, and the arrogant superiority that had defined their entire existence had been systematically obliterated in mere minutes. They were now left utterly alone in the smoldering wreckage of their own unparalleled greed. There were no hidden offshore accounts to rescue them. There were no wealthy in-laws to write a miraculous check. There was only the harsh, unyielding glare of the digital monitor displaying their crimes, the crushing weight of a federal ultimatum, and the cold reality that the executioner sitting directly across the table was fully prepared to drop the blade without mercy. The heavy mahogany doors settling back into their latches produced a hollow final thud that seemed to vacuum the remaining oxygen directly out of the private dining room. Sloane remained slumped in her chair, weeping with ragged, wet gasps that offered the only soundtrack to her absolute isolation. Her parents had vanished, taking her manufactured aristocratic shield with them. Kendall did not comfort her. He did not even look at her. He remained entirely paralyzed, his eyes locked onto the aggressive corporate seizure contract resting on the polished table. The digital monitor on the wall continued to display the frozen high-definition infrared image of his felony home invasion, casting a pale green glow over his sweating face. Mitchell stepped forward from the shadows of the adjacent parlor, moving with the quiet, terrifying efficiency of a coroner preparing a slab. He reached into his tailored suit pocket and retrieved a heavy silver fountain pen. The metallic scraping sound of Mitchell deliberately unscrewing the cap echoed sharply across the room, snapping Kendall out of his catatonic trance. Mitchell placed the uncapped pen directly beside the transfer documents, the polished silver gleaming under the ambient restaurant lighting. He stepped back and folded his hands silently, joining me in observing the imminent capitulation. Kendall stared at the instrument as if it were a loaded weapon. His hands began to shake violently, the tremors vibrating up his arms and causing his expensive suit jacket to flutter. He tried to speak, but his throat was completely dry. He was entirely stripped of the smug executive authority he had projected just 30 minutes prior. I checked my gold wristwatch with deliberate slowness. The automated digital cue holding the unredacted evidence package was steadily counting down toward the dawn transmission to the Federal Bureau of Investigation. Every passing second actively tightened the noose around his neck. I did not verbally rush him. The crushing weight of the federal threat provided all the necessary motivation. He slowly raised his right hand, hovering his trembling fingers over the silver pen. His breathing grew shallow and erratic. He looked intensely at the thick, heavy stack of papers detailing his federal wire fraud, then at the eviction notice bearing the county sheriff's red seal, and finally at the contract demanding the total surrender of his consulting firm. The stark, unforgiving reality of his absolute terminal checkmate was now entirely and permanently inescapable. Kendall had spent his entire life firmly believing that his expensive graduate business degree made him intellectually superior to his aging blue-collar father. He had always viewed my profound lack of formal academic pedigree as a definitive weakness. He fundamentally assumed that building a corporate empire through raw physical labor and relentless grit made me a primitive dinosaur in the modern financial sector. He strutted through glass boardrooms utilizing complex financial jargon, constructing intricate layers of leveraged debt, and treating my hard-earned capital as a massive unguarded piggy bank. He sneered at my conservative investment strategies, labeling my preference for unencumbered mortgage-free assets as cowardly and hopelessly outdated. He genuinely thought he could easily outsmart me simply by utilizing sophisticated corporate terminology and manipulating back-channel banking loopholes. He truly believed his academic background granted him the unquestionable authority to secretly liquidate my personal sanctuary and illegally weaponize my lifelong achievements. He had completely convinced himself that his highly polished modern executive persona effectively neutralized my decades of brutal street-forged strategic brilliance. He learned here tonight in the most devastating manner conceivable that an advanced degree cannot possibly defeat a man who constructed a ruthless international logistics network entirely from scratch. My intelligence was not formulated in comfortable university lecture halls. It was forged in the unforgiving trenches of ruthless commercial warfare where survival required absolute uncompromising discipline and a deeply ingrained capacity for executing total destruction when threatened. Kendall had arrogantly assumed I was a soft, easily manipulated target blinded by unconditional parental affection. He completely failed to recognize that a man who rises from poverty to extreme wealth never surrenders his predatory instincts. He never loses the absolute capacity to ruthlessly eliminate any existential threat to his empire, even if that threat shares his own bloodline. The sheer magnitude of his colossal miscalculation finally crushed his fragile ego. He realized that his sophisticated high-interest commercial loan was nothing but a clumsy amateurish trap I had explicitly allowed him to trigger. Every single arrogant maneuver he executed had been perfectly anticipated, meticulously documented, and flawlessly weaponized against him. The profound realization that his academic superiority was a completely worthless illusion, physically and visibly completely broke his spirit. He stared at the unforgiving legal documents, completely understanding that his entire corporate identity had been permanently dismantled by the exact same primitive blue-collar father he had so arrogantly attempted to destroy forever. The heavy silver pen felt like a massive anchor in Kendall's shaking hand. He lowered his gaze toward the stark white pages of the corporate transfer agreement, entirely defeated by the cold, absolute certainty of his impending incarceration. There was no remaining legal maneuver, no desperate negotiation, and absolutely no avenue of retreat left available to him. I watched his fractured spirit physically manifest as his shoulders slumped completely forward, breaking his arrogant posture into a pose of absolute pathetic submission. He pressed the fine metal nib against the initial signature line. A single drop of dark ink bled into the heavy paper before he finally began to write. The scratching sound of the pen moving across the document echoed loudly in the cavernous silence of the private room. He signed his name with jagged, defeated strokes, officially executing the total surrender of the financial consulting company he had spent 6 years building. He turned the crisp white page and signed his name again, completely liquidating his personal investment portfolios and transferring every single liquid asset he possessed directly into my corporate holding accounts. He initialed the massive penalty clauses, explicitly accepting full financial responsibility for clearing Sloan's toxic commercial eviction debt and entirely neutralizing the fraudulent business loan he had so recklessly secured against my property. He was legally stripping himself down to absolute zero. With every single signature, he systematically dismantled his own carefully constructed executive identity, permanently transferring the absolute totality of his wealth directly to the very father he had so arrogantly attempted to destroy. Sloan continued to sob uncontrollably in the background, her tears ruining the expensive designer fabric of her dress, completely incapable of preventing the sheer financial annihilation unfolding directly in front of her. Kendall reached the final page of the comprehensive agreement. His chest heaved with a ragged, utterly broken breath as he scrawled his signature one last time, cementing his absolute corporate surrender. He dropped the heavy silver pen onto the polished mahogany table, the metallic clatter marking the definitive conclusion of his massive, catastrophic rebellion. He pushed the signed document slowly across the table toward Mitchell. He did not look up. He sat completely paralyzed in the smoldering, inescapable wreckage of his own unparalleled greed, entirely aware that his privileged life was now permanently over. The absolute merciless and deeply final corporate correction was now finally and completely executed forever. Mitchell moved with the practiced grace of a seasoned corporate undertaker. He reached across the polished mahogany table and gathered the crisp white pages Kendall had just saturated with his frantic, defeated signatures. Mitchell tapped the edges of the heavy parchment against the wood, neatly aligning the transfer agreements, the asset liquidation authorizations, and the absolute forfeiture of the financial consulting firm. He snapped the heavy brass clasps of his leather briefcase shut, locking away the entirety of my son's professional identity. The sharp metallic click resonated loudly in the cavernous, oxygen-starved dining chamber. I stood up slowly from my leather chair, the leather creaking slightly under the sudden shift in weight. I deliberately buttoned the center button of my tailored suit jacket, executing the motion with a calm, unhurried precision. I looked down at the trembling, shattered man sitting across from me. Kendall was staring blankly at the empty space on the table where his entire future had rested just moments before. His chest heaved with shallow, erratic breaths, and his tailored suit hung loosely on his frame, as if the physical manifestation of his arrogance had literally deflated. I searched my own chest for a familiar spark of paternal rage for the burning disappointment that had fueled my initial counteroffensive. I found absolutely nothing. The intense burning anger that had consumed me since the night of the home invasion had completely evaporated, leaving behind a vast, freezing void. I felt only the cold, sterile emptiness of a definitively severed bond. The biological connection that had tethered us together for 35 years was completely eradicated, cleanly cauterized by the sheer magnitude of his monstrous greed. He was no longer my heir. He was no longer my legacy. He was simply a highly toxic liability that I had successfully neutralized and permanently excised from my corporate and personal ecosystem. The silence in the room stretched out thick and suffocating, wrapping around Kendall and Sloane like a heavy shroud. They sat completely paralyzed within the luxurious confines of the VIP dining room, entirely unable to process the absolute totality of their sudden, irreversible poverty. I observed the total destruction of their manufactured reality without a single ounce of pity or remorse. The surgical extraction was officially complete, leaving only the sterile, pristine environment of total corporate victory. My gaze lingered on his pale face for a very long and silent moment. I possessed absolutely no genuine interest in acquiring or managing a boutique financial consulting firm. The daily operations of Kendall's meticulously branded company were entirely irrelevant to my overarching corporate portfolio. I had not seized his business to integrate it into my own international logistics network, nor did I intend to personally oversee the shallow, highly leveraged portfolios of his elite suburban clients. My legal acquisition of his entire professional identity was engineered solely to establish absolute, undeniable dominance. I needed to completely eradicate the primary source of his unearned arrogance and publicly demonstrate the catastrophic consequences of attempting to quietly subvert my authority. For decades, Kendall had operated under the incredibly foolish delusion that building a multi-generational legacy required softening one's defensive perimeter. He believed that modern wealth should flow effortlessly downstream, entirely insulated from the brutal, uncompromising mechanics of actual wealth preservation. He had severely mistaken my deliberate restraint for debilitating weakness. The fundamental truth of extreme financial accumulation is completely devoid of sentimentality. Massive wealth is never successfully protected by passive accommodating kindness. It is guarded exclusively by the constant, unyielding projection of overwhelming strength and the absolute willingness to actively destroy any emerging threat regardless of its origin. A corporate empire is not a charity, and a family name is not a protective shield against the consequences of felony betrayal. By ruthlessly stripping him of his company, I was forcing him to finally comprehend the true nature of power. I was not merely punishing a rebellious child. I was systematically dismantling a dangerous, highly entitled adversary who had dared to leverage my hard-earned assets to finance his own fraudulent lifestyle. The immediate liquidation of his consulting firm would serve as a permanent, highly visible monument to his ultimate failure. Every single client he had courted, every business contact he had cultivated, and every financial asset he had leveraged would be systematically absorbed and dissolved by my holding company. He would be entirely erased from the professional sector he had so proudly occupied. This absolute corporate execution was the only viable method to permanently neutralize the threat he posed. The cold mechanical reality of wealth preservation dictates that when a parasite attaches itself to the primary host, the only appropriate response is total, uncompromising eradication. My son had forced my hand, and I simply applied the exact level of brutal force required to permanently secure my borders. I looked down at Kendall and Sloane, who were now sitting in complete, unbroken silence. The hysterical sobbing had finally ceased, replaced by a vacant, terrifying numbness. They stared at the polished wood, utterly broken by the sheer speed and absolute totality of their financial demise. I adjusted my cuffs and prepared to deliver the final, inescapable consequence of their boundless arrogance. I spoke with a quiet, glacial clarity, ensuring that every single word penetrated their paralyzed minds. I informed them that my legal team had already intercepted the fraudulent commercial loan paperwork that Kendall had so desperately transmitted to the predatory lending institution. While the federal authorities were currently processing the massive wire fraud charges, the bank itself had aggressively triggered its own strict internal protocols. Because Kendall had fundamentally defaulted on the primary terms of the agreement by submitting completely fabricated collateral, the lending firm had immediately accelerated the collection process. I explicitly clarified that the bank would officially foreclose on their heavily mortgaged suburban house in exactly 30 days. Their primary residence, the final physical sanctuary they possessed, was now completely and irrevocably lost. The massive looming foreclosure was a direct, undeniable result of the fraudulent loan they had actively manufactured to silence their immediate commercial debt. They had gambled their entire livelihood on a desperate, illegal maneuver, and they had spectacularly lost everything. They would be violently evicted from their own home, entirely stripped of their remaining social status, and permanently cast out into the freezing reality of severe poverty. There would be absolutely no last-minute rescue, no hidden trust funds, and no protective parental intervention. They were officially on their own. I turned away from the table, completely dismissing their ruined existence. The mahogany doors opened silently. Corinne stood gracefully in the elegant corridor, wearing a serene, untouchable expression that beautifully mirrored my own cold resolve. She had witnessed the entire execution from the adjacent parlor, perfectly aligned with the absolute necessity of the brutal correction. I walked toward her, offering my hand. She took it gently, her fingers warm and steady against my palm. We turned together and walked slowly down the long, luxurious hallway, our footsteps echoing with the quiet authority of total victory. We walked out of the quiet restaurant into the bright afternoon, completely leaving them far behind to rot forever within the dark, suffocating ruins of their own terrible making. Exactly 1 month had passed since the heavy mahogany doors of the private dining room clicked shut behind us, sealing Kendall and Sloane inside the cold vacuum of their own catastrophic ruin. The oppressive, suffocating tension that had defined my life for the past year was entirely gone, replaced by an expansive, profound tranquility. The brilliant morning sun crested the jagged peaks of the distant mountain range, casting long, golden rays across the pristine cedar deck of my newly acquired luxury cabin. The crisp alpine air was sharp and invigorating, completely devoid of the toxic manufactured anxiety that constantly permeated the suburban estate I had permanently left behind. I sat comfortably in a deep Adirondack chair, the thick handcrafted wood perfectly supporting my relaxed posture. I held a heavy ceramic mug in my right hand, taking slow, deliberate sips of strong black coffee. The bitter, robust flavor grounded me in the absolute perfection of the present moment. Across the polished glass table, Corinne reclined gracefully on a matching lounge chair. She was entirely absorbed in a thick, leather-bound historical novel, the morning breeze gently stirring the loose strands of her dark hair. The silence enveloping us was not the tense, pregnant quiet that precedes a violent corporate battle, but the deep, resonant stillness of a hard-won, permanent peace. We did not need to fill the air with meaningless chatter or frantic planning. The environment around us was impeccably clean and entirely unburdened by the parasitic demands of ungrateful dependents. I watched a pair of hawks circling effortlessly in the clear blue sky, their predatory grace mirroring the precise, unyielding strategy that had secured our current sanctuary. The violent severing of my biological legacy had not left a bleeding wound. It had successfully cauterized a fatal infection, allowing healthy tissue to finally thrive. The cabin itself was a fortress of isolation and luxury, situated miles away from the nearest paved road, accessible only by a private, heavily monitored security gate. It represented the ultimate physical manifestation of my newly established boundaries. I rested my coffee mug on the table, feeling the solid, undeniable weight of the glass against the wood. Every single element of this morning had been fiercely earned through uncompromising strength and calculated precision. We were finally breathing the clean, untainted air of absolute, undeniable victory, surrounded by a pure silence that belonged entirely and exclusively to us forever. The subsequent days following that definitive restaurant confrontation had unfolded with brutal mechanical efficiency. Mitchell had immediately moved to execute the signed documents, flawlessly finalizing the absolute liquidation of Kendall's independent financial consulting firm before the end of that very week. My son's precious corporate entity, the primary source of his insufferable arrogance, was systematically dissolved and absorbed into my holding company without a single complication. Every valuable client portfolio was aggressively reassigned, his leased office space was instantly vacated, and his professional reputation was permanently erased from the financial sector. The commercial bank acting upon the fraudulent documents we submitted to their internal fraud division formally foreclosed on his heavily mortgaged suburban estate. Concurrently, the final eviction notice regarding Sloane's vanity boutique had been executed by the county sheriff with unapologetic severity. Her carefully curated inventory of overpriced garments was seized to cover her massive unpaid lease, and the prime retail location she had so proudly flaunted was swiftly repurposed. Last week, Mitchell informed me that her former boutique had already been completely gutted and rapidly transformed into a generic high-volume franchise coffee shop, permanently wiping away any lingering trace of her elite social aspirations. The flawless, comprehensive financial execution was now completely, utterly finished. Stripped of their stolen capital and entirely cut off from the endless flow of unearned parental subsidies, Kendall and Sloane had been violently ejected from their aristocratic bubble. They were currently renting a cramped, decaying two-bedroom apartment located in a forgotten, highly undesirable industrial suburb far outside the city limits. There were absolutely no more luxury vehicles, no more exclusive country club memberships, and certainly no more wealthy in-laws waiting to write a miraculous rescue check. Arthur and Beatrice had completely severed all communication, thoroughly abandoning their disgraced daughter to preserve their own rapidly crumbling public image. Kendall was now forced to navigate the freezing, unforgiving reality of actual poverty, desperately seeking entry-level employment with a severely tarnished resume and a looming federal investigation constantly hanging over his head like a sharpened guillotine. The invisible labyrinth of corporate shell companies and blind trusts I had meticulously constructed continued to function flawlessly, fully insulating my vast estate from their toxic incompetence. I had successfully removed the parasites from the host, ensuring my empire remained completely secure. Their devastating downfall was a permanent, terrifying testament to the absolute, undeniable foolishness of attempting to outsmart a predator. Corinne gracefully lowered her heavy leather-bound novel, marking her page with a slim silver bookmark before placing it gently onto the glass table. She shifted slightly in her lounge chair, turning her face toward the warm morning sun. A soft, beautifully serene smile played across her lips as she looked directly at me. Her expression radiated a profound, completely unshakable contentment that mirrored the pristine mountain landscape surrounding our fortress. She reached across the polished surface of the table and delicately tapped her index finger against a glossy, brightly colored travel brochure resting near my coffee mug. The vibrant cover displayed the neon-drenched skyline and ancient temples of Japan. She looked into my eyes, her own eyes sparkling with a renewed, vibrant energy that had been completely absent during the suffocating months of Kendall's relentless manipulation. She asked in a quiet, incredibly peaceful voice if the bustling, luminous streets of Tokyo would be our next destination. I looked at the brochure, then back at the remarkable woman who had stood firmly by my side throughout the entire brutal ordeal. I offered a slow, deeply resolute nod, confirming her request with absolute certainty. The heavy, toxic burden of my past life had been entirely liquidated, opening up a limitless, untethered future for us both. I reached across the table and took her right hand, interlacing my fingers firmly with hers. The physical contact was grounding a silent, powerful affirmation of our shared victory and unbroken solidarity. We had survived the venomous, parasitic attacks of entitled dependence by deploying calculated, merciless retaliation. A definitive, permanent new order had been successfully established within our lives. The fragile illusions of unconditional family loyalty had been completely stripped away, replaced by the hardened, undeniable truth of our own formidable strength. True peace, I finally understood, is never freely given or passively maintained by avoiding necessary confrontations. It is aggressively secured and fiercely guarded by the absolute uncompromising power of those who simply refuse to be manipulated, exploited, or treated as helpless victims. I squeezed Corinne's hand gently, taking another deeply satisfying sip of my strong black coffee as I gazed out over the sprawling, sunlit valley. The quiet morning air remained perfectly still, signaling the beautiful, enduring calm that follows a flawlessly executed storm. We were completely free, entirely untouchable, and finally, without a single lingering doubt, absolutely ready to truly live our lives again.